I am your host Jack, and welcome to RiddleStop. I won't waste any time, let's begin with the mystery. The Mountain Keeps Its Dead, a Nero Wolfe mystery. Chapter 1. The Stoop. It was Cato who arrived first. That is not precisely accurate. All three of them came together, and I did not know his name was Cato until later. But when I opened the front door of the brownstone on that Tuesday morning in October, and found 3 Doberman pinschers sitting on the stoop in the rain, it was the largest one who held my attention. He was coal black, rain dark, and he was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as patience that had been earned the hard way. The other 2 sat flanking him like punctuation. None of them made a sound. I said good morning, because I say good morning to everyone, and the large one regarded me as if he was deciding whether I was worth the effort of a response. I stepped back inside and called toward the office. Wolfe, no answer. It was 10:15, which meant he was upstairs with the orchids and Theodore, doing the 2 hours of morning work that constituted his primary obligation to the universe. I was not supposed to interrupt him during plant hours except in cases of genuine emergency, and I had never been entirely clear on where 3 Dobermans on the front stoop fell on that spectrum. I went back to the door. They were still there. The rain had picked up, and they were getting wetter, and they gave no sign of minding. The large one had not moved his eyes from the spot where my face had been. I will admit that I stood there for a moment trying to decide what to do, which is not something I enjoy admitting. I handle most situations without deliberation. These were dogs. I am not afraid of dogs. But there was something about the way these 3 were sitting. The precision of it, the stillness, the complete absence of the tail wagging and anxiety and general canine enthusiasm that characterizes most dogs encountering a stranger, that gave me pause. They were not behaving like lost dogs. They were behaving like dogs who had arrived somewhere on purpose. I went to the house phone and buzzed the plant rooms. Wolfe's voice came through after the 3rd buzz, which meant he was annoyed. What is it? 3 Dobermans on the front stoop. They appear to be waiting for an appointment. A silence. Then, describe them. I described them. Size, coloring, condition, tired, travel-worn, but not starved or injured. The way they were sitting. The fact that the largest one hadn't taken his eyes off the door. Another silence. This one was different. I have worked for Nero Wolfe for 11 years, and I know his silence is the way a sailor knows weather. This one was not the silence of a man thinking. It was the silence of a man who has been handed something he was not expecting, and has gone very still while he decides what it means. Bring them in, he said. All 3. Put them in the front room. Fritz isn't going to. I'll speak to Fritz. He hung up. I stood with the house phone in my hand for a moment, then went back to the front door. Gentlemen, I said, and stepped aside. The large one came in first, which seemed right. He crossed the threshold with a deliberateness that I later described to Lily Rowan as the most dignified entrance I had ever witnessed in that hallway, including 2 federal judges and a former Secretary of State. The 2nd one followed, and the 3rd. They stood in the hallway and took in the brownstone with the quiet attention of guests who have been told the house rules and intend to observe them. Fritz appeared from the kitchen, took one look, and said something in Swiss German that I chose not to translate. Wolfe's orders, I said. Those are very large dogs, Archie. I had noticed that Fritz, they will want to eat. I imagine so. He looked at them for another moment with the expression of a man revising his afternoon. Then he said, I will see what we have, and went back to the kitchen, which is Fritz's version of acceptance. He would feed them something extraordinary. He always does. I settled the 3 of them in the front room, and went to my desk to wait for Wolfe to come down from the plant rooms at 11 o'clock. I used the time to look at them through the open door and try to work out the questions that needed answering. There were several. The most pressing was how 3 trained Dobermans, and they were trained, manifestly and precisely trained, in a way you could see in every movement, had arrived at 918 West 35th Street without a human being attached to them. The second most pressing question was why Wolfe's voice had gone the way it did when I described them. At 11:03 Wolfe's step came down the hall and he appeared in the office doorway. He was wearing the yellow shirt, which meant the morning had gone well with the orchids. He walked to his chair, lowered his 1/7 of a ton into it, and then turned his head and looked through the doorway at the 3 dogs in the front room. The large one, Cato, though I did not know it yet, looked back at him. It lasted perhaps 15 seconds, which is a very long time when nothing is happening. Then Wolfe said, without looking away from the dog, "Get me beer." I got him beer. When I came back, he was still looking at the dog and the dog was still looking at him. I set the beer on the desk. You know them. I know who sent them. And Hasias the Thulsa. He reached for the glass. His hand, I noticed, was not entirely steady, which in 11 years I had seen exactly twice. His name was Drav Vasic. He was a man I knew in another life, in another country, in circumstances I will not discuss. He was a naturalist. He spent many years training animals as others might spend years writing a book, with the belief that what he was making would outlast him. He drank. It appears he was right. Was, I said. Yes? When? I don't know. Recently enough that they are not yet desperate. He set down the glass. Find out where they came from. Track their point of origin. They have been traveling north to south, which means upstate, somewhere in the mountain counties. A man like Vasic would have lived near water. He paused. He would have lived somewhere that looked like home. I already had my notebook out. What else can you tell me about him? Wolfe was quiet for a moment. He was the finest man I have known who did not live in this house, he said, and picked up his book, which meant the subject was closed. I found Vasic by 3 o'clock. It was not difficult. A man with 3 Dobermans and a naturalist's habits leaves a trail in rural communities, feed orders, veterinary records, the kind of local reputation that accumulates quietly over years. I worked the telephone for 2 hours, calling county offices and feed suppliers, and one very helpful woman at a post office in a town called Heron Lake in the Adirondack foothills, who told me that yes, she knew Mr. Vasic, the foreign gentleman with the dogs. And wasn't it terrible what had happened? He'd been found in the lake 4 days ago. The sheriff said it was an accident. I thanked her and hung up and sat at my desk for a moment. Then I went to the office doorway. Wolfe was on his 2nd beer and his 3rd chapter. Vasic is dead, I said. Found in a lake 4 days ago. Heron Lake, Essex County. Sheriff called it accidental. Wolfe did not look up from his book, but he stopped turning the page. A town called Heron Lake, I continued. Stone house on the water, from what I gather. The dogs have been traveling for at least 3 days, maybe 4. Wolfe set the book down. He looked at the front room where the 3 Dobermans had settled, Cato near the door, the 2nd one along the wall, the 3rd at the window, watching the street. Then he looked at the ceiling for a long moment, in the way he does when he is having an argument with himself that he has already lost. Tell Fritz to prepare for a journey, he said. I kept my face neutral. In 11 years Nero Wolfe had left this brownstone voluntarily, on a number of occasions I could count on one hand and have fingers remaining. How long? A week, perhaps less if I am fortunate. He did not sound as though he expected to be fortunate. We will leave tomorrow morning. We, you, myself, and Fritz. He picked up his book again. And the dogs, of course. Of course, I said. I went to find Fritz. He took the news with the equanimity of a man who has survived a great deal working for Nero Wolfe, which meant he closed his eyes briefly, opened them, and said he would need to know about the kitchen facilities. I told him I had no idea about the kitchen facilities. He said he would pack accordingly. I went upstairs to my room and sat on the bed and thought about Nero Wolfe packing a bag to drive 4 hours into the Adirondacks to investigate the death of a man he hadn't spoken to in 11 years and wouldn't explain. I thought about the way his hand had been unsteady reaching for the beer glass. Then I packed my own bag, put my .38 in it, and went to bed early. The 3 dogs slept in the front room. I could hear them sometimes when I passed in the hall, not moving, not pacing, just breathing, quietly, in the dark, in a house that wasn't theirs yet. Chapter 2. The Road North. We left at 7 in the morning, which meant Wolfe was awake before 6, which in 11 years had happened exactly never. I did not comment on this. The car was my Heron, a 1952 Buick Roadmaster that I maintained with the devotion some men reserve for religion, and it was crowded in a way I had not anticipated when I agreed to this arrangement the previous evening. Wolfe occupied the front passenger seat, which he always did on the rare occasions we traveled together, partly because of his size and partly because riding in the back made him carsick, and he considered carsickness beneath his dignity. Fritz was in the back with 2 large leather bags, a wooden crate containing provisions he had deemed non-negotiable, and 3 Dobermans. The 3 Dobermans, to their credit, made no fuss about this. Cato arranged himself along the seat with his head resting on Fritz's knee with the confidence of a dog who has decided that a man is trustworthy, which Fritz received with an expression of startled pleasure he quickly brought under control. The 2nd one, I was already thinking of her as the observant one, though I did not yet have a name for her, curled into the footwell with an efficiency that suggested she had done this before. The 3rd sat upright between Fritz and the door and watched the city give way to highway with the focused attention of a dog who finds travel professionally interesting. By the time we crossed into Westchester, I had established the following. Wolfe was not going to talk. Fritz was going to pretend everything was normal, and the 3 dogs were better traveling companions than most humans I had driven with. It was a clear October morning, cold and sharp, with the kind of light that makes the Hudson Valley look like a painting of itself. I drove north on Route 9 and then picked up the Northway, and the miles went by and the trees started changing color and getting taller, and the air, even through the window glass, felt different, thinner and cleaner, with a bite to it that you do not get in Manhattan regardless of what the weather is doing. Wolfe looked out the passenger window. He did not read, which was unusual. He did not complain about my driving, which was also unusual. He watched the landscape with an expression I could not entirely categorize, not nostalgia exactly, not quite recognition, something more like a man looking at a country that rhymes with a country he once knew. At 9:30 I stopped at a diner outside Glens Falls for coffee and to stretch. Wolfe got out of the car and stood in the parking lot for a moment and breathed the mountain air with his eyes closed, and I noticed Cato had come to stand beside him without being invited or directed, just beside him, 6 inches from his left knee. Wolfe looked down at the dog. The dog looked up at him. Neither of them said anything, which seemed to suit them both. Fritz brought coffee to the car in paper cups, which he considered barbaric and accepted as a condition of the mission. We drove on. At 11:15 I turned off the county road onto a gravel track that wound uphill through birch trees for about half a mile, and then opened without warning onto a clearing above a lake. I stopped the car. The house was stone, dark grey fieldstone, 3 stories, with a slate roof and deep-set windows and a wide porch across the back that faced the water. It had the look of a house that had been built by someone who was not in a hurry and did not intend to leave. The lake below it was about a mile across, very still, reflecting the October sky in a way that made it look bottomless. The mountains beyond it were blue-green and enormous, and they went on until they disappeared into a haze at the edge of what you could see. I heard Wolfe breathe out beside me. One slow breath. Yes, he said, to no one in particular. He would have chosen this. I parked in the gravel drive beside a mud-caked Ford sedan that I catalogued automatically. New York plates, Albany County, recently driven, alone in the lot in a way that suggested it had been there for a day at least. I would find out whose it was shortly. We got out. Fritz began organizing the provisions with the focused efficiency of a general establishing a field kitchen. The 3 dogs emerged from the back and stood in the cold air and looked at the lake, and for a moment none of them moved. Just 3 dark shapes against the pale morning light, looking at the water where their owner had died. Ajax made a sound then, very low, barely audible. Not a whine, and not a growl, but something between them that I had no word for. Cato turned and looked at him. Ajax was quiet. I was still watching this when the front door of the house opened, and a woman came out. She was 30 or so, dark-haired, with her father's long face and her father's direct eyes. I knew this later, from a photograph I found inside. But at the time I simply registered that she had the look of someone who had been crying recently and had decided to stop. She was wearing dark trousers and a grey wool sweater, and she had her arms crossed, not against the cold but in the particular way people hold themselves when they are keeping something in. She looked at me. She looked at Wolfe. Then she looked at the 3 dogs, and something in her face shifted, not surprise exactly, but a kind of confirmation, as though she had been waiting to see whether they had arrived. "They found you," she said. It was not a question. Wolfe said, "Miss Vassich." She looked at him for a long moment. "He talked about you," she said. "For years he talked about you." I thought she stopped, started again. "He said if anything ever happened, the dogs would know what to do." Her voice was steady and careful in the way of someone who has had to be steady and careful for several days and is running low on the resources required for it. I didn't entirely believe him. "Your father," Wolfe said, "was usually right about the things that mattered." She looked at him for another moment, and I thought she was going to say something sharp, or break down, or both. She did neither. She simply nodded and said, "Come inside. The lawyer is already here, which tells you something I imagine you'll want to know." She turned and went back through the door. Wolfe and I exchanged a glance. He raised an eyebrow perhaps 2 millimeters, which in his vocabulary constitutes significant editorial comment. "The Ford," I said. "Yes." He moved toward the door. "Find out everything about him before dinner." The inside of the house was the inside of a man's entire life. Books covered 2 of the 4 walls in the main room, not decorative books, not matched sets, but the kind of books that accumulate when a person reads seriously for 50 years and doesn't cull. Field guides, monographs, natural history in 6 languages. Between the shelves, pinned and framed, were sketches, animal studies, landscape drawings, anatomical diagrams done in a precise hand. A large oak desk sat facing the window that looked out on the lake, its surface covered with the organized disorder of a man in the middle of work he had not expected to leave unfinished. I stood in the doorway of that room for a moment and looked at it. Wolfe came to stand beside me. He looked at the desk, and the books, and the drawings, and the view through the window of the lake below. "Leave this room," he said, "exactly as it is. Touch nothing. The lawyer's been in here already, I'd bet." "Almost certainly." He turned away. "Which is why we need to know exactly what he touched." Peter Strand was in the kitchen. He was 55, well-made, with silver hair cut close, and the kind of careful tailoring that announces Albany money without shouting about it. He was drinking coffee at the kitchen table, and he stood when we came in with the smooth social reflex of a man who has spent decades in rooms where standing at the right moment matters. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, with the tone of a man who has heard the name and prepared a response. "I'm Peter Strand. I was Drav Vasich's attorney." "Were you?" Wolfe said. He sat at the kitchen table without being invited, which is his standard operating procedure in any room. "When did he retain you?" Strand's smile stayed in place, but something behind it recalibrated. 7 years ago, estate planning primarily, and you drove up from Albany yesterday." "That's right. When I heard about Drav's death, I thought it important to—" "Who told you?" A pause. Brief but there. "I beg your pardon. Who informed you of Vasich's death?" Wolfe said. "And at what time?" I had my notebook out. Strand looked at it, then back at Wolfe, and his smile adjusted itself into something more carefully neutral. "A colleague telephoned me," he said. "Tuesday evening." "The body was found Tuesday morning," I said. "The family, Miss Vasich, was notified Tuesday afternoon. You arrived Wednesday morning, which means you were on the road before most people in Heron Lake knew Vasich was dead." "My colleague has connections in the county," Strand said, evenly. "How convenient," I said. Wolfe pushed back from the table and stood. "I will want to speak with you further, Mr. Strand. This afternoon if you're available, and you are." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "One question. In 7 years of handling Vasich's estate planning, did he ever mention a document, a specific personal document, not a legal instrument, that he intended to preserve separately from his will?" Strand's face was very still. "Not that I recall." "Thank you," Wolfe said, and went to find his room. Fritz had located the largest bedroom and was already unpacking with the methodical calm of a man who has decided that if he is to be in the mountains, he will at minimum have a proper pillow arrangement. The 3 dogs had distributed themselves through the house, Cato near the door of what would become Wolfe's room, the observant one at the top of the stairs, Ajax doing slow circuits of the ground floor with his nose a half-inch from the baseboards, reading the house the way I read a case file. I took the room at the end of the hall, set my bag on the chair, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked out the window at the lake. The water was very still. A dock extended from the shore below the house, old wood, a rowboat tied at its end. On the far side of the lake, through the trees, I could make out the roofline of a smaller structure, a cottage, occupied, with smoke coming from the chimney. I noted it and went back downstairs to begin earning my salary. I found Marta Vasich on the back porch, looking at the water. She heard me come out but didn't turn. I stood beside her for a moment and looked at the lake with her, because sometimes that is the right approach, and experience has taught me to recognize when. After a while she said, "He didn't fall." "No," I said. "I didn't think so either." She turned then and looked at me with the direct, appraising look that I was already associating with the Vasich family. "Wolfe will find out what happened." It wasn't a question, but I answered it anyway. "That's why we're here." She looked back at the water. "My father trusted very few people in his life. Completely trusted, I mean. Not just relied on, trusted." She paused. "Nero Wolfe was one of them. I used to think that was strange, that he'd never even mentioned meeting him. But father kept things in separate rooms. He always said the most important things don't need to be talked about." "What else did he keep in separate rooms?" She was quiet for a long moment. Below us the dock creaked in a small wind off the lake. "There was a document," she said finally. "He mentioned it once, about 2 years ago. He said there was something he had been keeping for a long time that was almost ready to be used, that the right moment was coming." She paused. I asked him what he meant, and he changed the subject. "I didn't push because—" She stopped. "Because he was your father, and there were rooms you didn't go into," I said. She looked at me. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." I wrote it down. We stood on the porch for another few minutes in the cold, clear air, and below us the lake held the mountains and the sky in its stillness and did not give anything back. That night Fritz made a meal from the provisions he had packed, a lamb stew that filled the stone house with a smell so good that even Wolfe, who had eaten in the kitchen in near silence, and looked out the window at the dark lake with the expression of a man having a long internal argument, finished his bowl and accepted a second without being asked. The 3 dogs ate in the corner of the kitchen from bowls Fritz had sourced from the pantry. Another thing about these 3 that I had not expected. No fuss, no competition, no guarding. Cato ate, then Juno. I was using the names Wolfe had given them that afternoon, quietly, without explanation, as though the names had always existed. Then Ajax. Sequential, orderly, patient. Wolfe watched them while he ate. After dinner I went to the porch with a glass of rye and sat in the cold and looked at the darkness where the lake was. Somewhere across the water a light burned in the cottage I had seen from my window. I thought about Peter Strand and his Albany colleague with county connections. I thought about Marta's face when she said he didn't fall. I thought about a document that had been kept for a long time and was almost ready to be used. I thought about Wolfe saying he was the finest man I have known who did not live in this house, and then picking up his book. I finished my rye and went inside. Cato was in the hallway outside Wolfe's door. He had settled across the threshold, not blocking it, just present, just there. I looked at him for a moment. Good instinct, I said. He regarded me with the patience of something very old, and went back to watching the dark. Chapter 3. The Lake. I was up at 6:30, which in the mountains in October means darkness giving way to a grey that is not quite light, the kind of morning that arrives apologetically and asks nothing of you yet. I dressed, put on my coat, and went downstairs. Cato was no longer across Wolfe's threshold. He was at the front door, standing with the particular stillness that I was learning meant he had already been awake for some time and had already decided something. I opened the door for him and he went out without acknowledgement, which I was also learning was simply how he operated. Cato did not thank you for doors. He passed through them. I made coffee in the kitchen. Fritz's equipment was already arranged on the counter with the geometric precision he imposes on every kitchen he occupies, and stood at the window with the cup and looked at the lake. It was the color of pewter in the early light. Flat, very still, with a low mist sitting on the surface that would burn off in an hour. The dock below extended into it like an unfinished sentence. The rowboat at its end knocked softly against the wood in a small current that I couldn't see but could infer. A man had gone into that water 4 days ago and not come out on his own. I finished the coffee, put on my coat, and went to find Sheriff Cole Dunbar. The sheriff's office was in the town of Heron Lake, which was 4 miles down the county road, and consisted of a general store, a post office, a diner called Patsy's that smelled of bacon and honest effort, and a municipal building the size of a generous living room that housed the sheriff's department, the town clerk, and what appeared to be a storage situation involving road signs that had gotten out of hand. Sheriff Cole Dunbar was at his desk when I arrived at 7:45. He was 50 solid, with a face that had been outdoors for most of those 50 years, and a manner that told you he had been a competent man in a small jurisdiction for long enough that competence had become comfortable, and comfort had become the thing he was most interested in protecting. He looked at my card. He looked at me. He looked at my card again. "Archie Goodwin," he said. "You work for Nero Wolfe." "I do." "The detective, the fat one." He prefers to think of himself as large. Dunbar set the card on his desk with the care of a man setting down something he is not sure he wants to touch. "Who hired him?" "That's between Mr. Wolfe and his client." "In my county," Dunbar said, "when a man drowns in a lake, it's my business who's poking around asking questions about it." "Absolutely," I said. "Which is why I'm here talking to you instead of poking around without talking to you. I'm extending a professional courtesy." He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether to be annoyed. He settled on cautious. "What do you want to know?" "Tell me about the morning the body was found." He told me. Wednesday, 6 days ago. A fisherman named Roy Peck had been out early on the lake and found Vasich floating face down about 40 yards from the dock, called it in at 6:20. Dunbar arrived at 7, examined the scene with his deputy, a young man named Carver, who was not present this morning. The body showed no signs of violence, no marks inconsistent with a drowning. Vasich had been known to walk the dock in the evenings, sometimes in the dark. The wood was old, and there were sections where the planking was uneven. Dunbar had ruled it accidental pending the coroner's report, which he expected to confirm his assessment. I wrote all of this down. Then I said, "What sections of the dock are uneven?" Dunbar frowned. "The middle section mainly, 3rd and 4th plank from the—" He stopped. "Why?" "The body was found 40 yards out," I said. "The dock is maybe 30 feet long. If he fell from the middle section, he'd be in the water less than 10 yards from shore, unless there was a current strong enough to move a body 40 yards overnight. Is there?" Dunbar was quiet. "And if he walked off the end," I said, "he'd have had to walk past the uneven section in the dark, negotiate it successfully, reach the end of the dock, and then somehow go into the water. I paused. What were the conditions Wednesday morning? Wind? Current? It was calm, Dunbar said. He said it like a man who had just heard a door close on something he had been hoping to keep open. So the body didn't drift, I said. He looked at his desk, then at the window, then at me with the expression of a man who has been comfortable for a long time and has just been made uncomfortable by an out-of-town stranger in a good overcoat, and resents it, even though he knows the stranger is right. The coroner's report, he said, isn't final. No, I agreed, it isn't. I stood and picked up my hat. Mr. Wolfe will want to speak with you later today or tomorrow, at the house. He doesn't travel well, so he won't be coming to you, and I'll ask you in advance to resist the instinct to be offended by that because it's not personal. It applies to everyone, including the mayor of New York. I gave him my best straightforward smile. We appreciate your cooperation, Sheriff. I left him with his desk and his window and the problem of 40 yards. The dock was old but not treacherous. I walked it twice, slowly, in the morning light with the mist mostly gone, and the lake showing itself in its full October color, dark blue-green, cold, with the mountains around it making the sky feel lower than it was. The uneven planking Dunbar had mentioned was in the third and fourth sections from shore, and it was real, 2 boards slightly raised at one end, the kind of thing your foot finds in the dark if you're not looking. But it was not the kind of thing that pitches a man into the water. It was the kind of thing that makes you stumble and catch yourself and curse, and walk more carefully. I stood at the end of the dock and looked out at the water. 40 yards. I paced it back along the dock, then measured 40 yards along the shore with my eye. It was not a short distance. In calm water, in the dark, a man entering from the dock would have to be propelled with some force to reach it, or assisted toward it after entry, or, and this was the thought I had been working toward, he had not gone into the water from the dock at all. I crouched and looked at the dock's edge planking. Old wood, weathered grey. Halfway along the left side, there was a mark, fresh, lighter than the weathered surface around it, a scrape perhaps 8 inches long at the level where a rope or a cable would rest if you were pulling something alongside. I looked at it for a while. Then I looked at the rowboat. The rowboat was tied at the dock's end with a painter, a length of rope, old and mossy, fixed to a cleat, but the oarlocks were dry and there were no oars in the boat, which meant the oars were stored somewhere else, which meant the boat was not habitually left ready to use, which meant if someone had used it recently, the oars had been sourced and returned deliberately. I noted all of this and went back to the house. Wolfe was on the back porch. This was sufficiently surprising that I stopped in the doorway for a moment to confirm what I was seeing. He was in the large wooden chair that Fritz had relocated from inside with the combined effort of Fritz, myself, and basic physics, and he was sitting with his hands folded on his stomach looking at the lake. He was wearing his coat and his hat, and the expression of a man who has decided that if he is going to be outside, he will be outside on his own terms. Cato was beside him, exactly beside him, 6 inches from the chair, sitting with the same orientation, both of them looking at the water. I came out and reported. All of it. Dunbar, the dock, the 40 yards, the scrape on the planking, the dry oarlocks. Wolfe listened without moving. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. The rowboat, he said. Who has access to it besides the household? Anyone who knows it's there. There's no lock on the dock, no gate on the property. You could come across the lake from the far shore, or up the access road, or through the woods from the county road. The cottage across the water. Yes, among other approaches. He looked at the lake. Vasich was a naturalist. He would have been observant about his property and the people near it. If he knew someone was using his boat or his dock without his knowledge, he would have noted it. He paused. His desk. Untouched, I said. Except for whatever Strand got to before we arrived. Then his desk is our next priority. He pushed himself to his feet, which outdoors and without his routine took slightly more effort than usual, though he would have cut out my tongue before acknowledging it. After lunch, Fritz has indicated that lunch will be at 12:30 and I see no reason to disagree with him. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Archie? Yes. The scrape on the dock. Photograph it if you have the means, and measure it precisely. A rope makes a different mark than a chain. A chain makes a different mark than a cable. He looked at the lake once more. Someone moved a body on the water. They used a mechanism. Mechanisms leave evidence. He went inside. Cato remained on the porch for another moment, looking at the lake, then followed him. Ruth Halsey arrived at 10:15. I had been expecting her. I had telephoned her from the sheriff's office, having gotten her name and number from Dunbar, who mentioned her with the casual confidence of a man who has decided she is not relevant, and she came in a battered Plymouth that she parked with more precision than the car deserved. She was 60, solid, grey-haired, with hands that had spent a great deal of time working, and a face that had spent a great deal of time keeping its own counsel. She had a key to the house. She let herself in the front and stopped when she found me in the hallway. "You must be the detective's man," she said. "Archie Goodwin," I said. "Yes." She looked past me toward the main room, and something in her face went careful in the way of someone who is deciding how much of a private map to show a stranger. "I came to collect a few things of Drav's that Marta asked me to box up." "Of course," I said. "Before you do, could I ask you a few questions?" She considered this with the thoughtfulness of a woman who does not answer questions before she has decided whether she trusts the person asking them. Then she said, "I suppose," and followed me to the kitchen where Fritz, with magnificent social instinct, produced coffee and a plate of the small pastries he had brought from the city, and Ruth Halsey sat at the kitchen table and decided, "I think that any household producing pastries of that quality deserved a degree of cooperation." "How long did you work for Mr. Vasich?" I asked. "Uthornsea," I asked. "4 years, come November." "What was he like?" She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "Serious, but kind underneath it. The kind of man who doesn't talk unless he has something to say, but when he says it you want to write it down." She paused. "He was very good with those dogs. Patient. You'd watch him with them and you'd think, that man understands animals better than he understands people. But then he'd say something to you and you'd realize he understood people just fine. He just preferred the company of animals." "Did he have many visitors?" "Not many. Mr. Oost from across the lake regularly. A few people from the university. He'd consult sometimes on wildlife studies. Dr. Pembridge from the County Historical Society, a handful of times." She paused, and the careful look returned. "And one man I didn't know, 3 times in the past year. Always arrived after dark, always left before morning. Drav never introduced him." I kept my voice neutral. "Can you describe him?" "City man, 60 or so, good coat. He walked like someone who was used to having space around him," she considered. "The last time was about 6 weeks ago. They were in the study for 4 hours. When the man left, Drav sat on the porch for a long time by himself." I wrote it all down. Then I said, "Did Mr. Vasich seem worried in the weeks before his death?" She looked at her coffee. "He seemed like a man who had made a decision and was living with the weight of it." She paused. "That's the best I can put it. Not frightened, decided. Like he'd pushed something into motion and was waiting for it to land." "One more question, Mrs. Halsey. When you came to clean on the Tuesday, the morning he was found." "I didn't come that Tuesday," she said. "I was due to come Thursday. I only heard about it Thursday morning from Roy Peck." I looked up from my notebook. "So you weren't here Tuesday?" "No." "Were you here the Monday before? The day before he was found?" She set down her cup very precisely in its saucer. "Yes, Monday afternoon." She paused. "The study door was closed. He asked me not to go in. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes he was working and wanted quiet." Another pause, slower, but there was someone else in the house. I could hear 2 voices through the door. I didn't recognize the second one. "Man or woman?" "Man," she said. "Young, I think. Or youngish." I wrote it down. We sat in the kitchen for a moment with the sound of the lake through the window and Fritz moving quietly at the counter, preparing things for lunch. Then Ruth Halsey said, without looking up from her cup, "He didn't fall off that dock." "No," I said. "We don't think so either." She nodded once, stood, and went to box up Drav Vasich's things. Lunch was consommé, bread and cold cuts that Fritz elevated through sheer force of professional will. Wolfe ate without speaking. Marta Vasich had not come down. Strand ate quickly and excused himself, which I noted. Jax sat under the table, not begging, just present, in the way he had of making himself available to the room without imposing on it. Afterward, Wolfe went to the study. He stood in the doorway for a full minute without entering, looking at the desk, the books, the drawings on the wall, the window and the lake beyond it. Reconstructing, I knew, the man who had occupied this room from the evidence the room contained about him. Then he went to the desk and sat in Vasich's chair, which probably fit him poorly, and began going through the drawers with the methodical patience of a man reading a book he knows will eventually tell him what he needs. I went around the room looking at the walls. The drawings were precise and unsentimental. Field sketches, animal studies, the kind of work done outdoors with cold hands and no time for decoration. Mixed among them were photographs, some old, some newer. Vasich with the 3 dogs in various configurations over the years, the dogs aging in the background of his life like a timeline. Landscape photographs, mountains, always mountains, though not all the same mountains. Some were not the Adirondacks, some were older country. One photograph stopped me. It was small, black and white, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges. Two young men standing on a rock above what looked like a river gorge, mountains behind them, both squinting into sunlight. One of them I did not recognize. He was lean and dark and had a look about him of someone who lived outdoors as a matter of course rather than a choice. The other one I did recognize, though it took me a moment, because I had never seen him young before. I took the photograph off the wall and brought it to the desk. Wolfe looked at it for a long time. Then he set it face down on the desk and said, "Continue looking at the walls," in a voice that was entirely steady and completely final. I put the photograph back. In the bottom right drawer of the desk, behind a hanging file of correspondence, Wolfe found it. Not the document, but what the document had left behind, a manila envelope, letter-sized, empty. The flap had been sealed and then opened, not torn, opened carefully, with a letter knife or a thin blade, and resealed imperfectly so that a faint irregular line showed in the dried glue where it had been separated and then pressed back together. Inside the envelope was nothing but a faint rectangular impression in the paper where something had rested for a long time. Wolfe set the envelope on the desk between us. "Someone read it," I said. "Opened it, read whatever was inside, resealed it, or removed it," Wolfe said. "The document itself may have been taken, or it was moved by Vasich himself when he realized his study was not secure." He looked at the empty envelope. If he moved it somewhere he considered safer, and if he realized his study was not secure, it means he knew someone had been in it without his permission. I thought of Ruth Halsey. The study door was closed. He asked me not to go in, but that was Monday. And the envelope had been opened and resealed. That took time and care and the intent to conceal. That was not Monday's visitor. "Someone was in this study before Monday," I said. "Before whatever meeting Halsey overheard." "Yes." Wolfe stood from the chair. He looked at the empty envelope once more, then at the window and the lake. "The document was either taken before Vasich died, which means the murder was committed for another reason, or it was taken after, which means the killer had access to this house after the death and before our arrival." "Strand," I said. "He is the most obvious candidate for post-death access," Wolfe said. "He arrived before he was called. He had 12 hours alone in this house with Marta, who was in no condition to monitor his movements. He moved to the door, but obvious candidates, in my experience, are either guilty or placed. We will need to determine which." He went out and I stood alone in Vasich's study with the empty envelope and the drawings and the photographs, and the particular silence of a room that still felt occupied by the man who was no longer in it. Through the window the lake was very blue in the afternoon light. Somewhere in it or around it or in the house above it was the truth about what had been kept and what had been taken, and what a man had died to protect. I put my notebook in my pocket and went to find out what was on the far side of the lake. Chapter 4. The cottage across the water. The rowboat had oars after all. I found them in the small wooden shed at the base of the dock, hanging on 2 iron pegs above a collection of tools that told you a great deal about Vasich. Everything maintained, nothing discarded. A man who believed that a useful object deserved to remain useful. I took the oars down, fit them into the locks, and pushed off from the dock into the cold afternoon. The lake was about a mile across at its widest point, but the cottage sat roughly opposite and slightly south, which put it at maybe 600 yards from Vasich's dock. I rowed steadily and let myself think. Willem Oost, Dutch-born ornithologist, Vasich's neighbor for, according to Ruth Halsey, at least 4 years, possibly longer. A man who studied birds for a living, which meant patience and precision, and a professional habit of watching things without being seen. He lived across the water from a man who had been murdered. He had a boat of his own, presumably, because you do not live on a mountain lake without a boat. He had access to the water between the two properties at any hour. I was not rushing to conclusions. I was noting proximities. The cottage came into view as I rounded a slight curve of the shoreline, smaller than Vasich's house, built of wood rather than stone, with a dock of its own in better repair than Vasich's and a light aluminium canoe tied alongside it. Smoke from the chimney, as I had observed from my window that morning. A man standing on the dock watching me row toward him. He had been watching me for some time, I judged. He had the stillness of a man accustomed to staying still while observing things in motion. I shipped the oars and let the rowboat come alongside the dock. He caught the painter I tossed and tied it with the quick competence of someone who has handled boats all his life. "Mr. Goodwin," he said. "I expected you yesterday, actually." I climbed onto the dock. "You know who I am. Marta telephoned me last night. She said Nero Wolfe had come." He extended his hand. Willem Oost. He was 55 or so, lean, with a weathered face and pale eyes that had the habit of focus that birdwatchers develop, the ability to fix on a point and hold it without the small unconscious movements that most people make. His handshake was firm without making a point of it. He was wearing canvas trousers and a heavy wool shirt, and he looked entirely at home on a dock in October in the Adirondacks, which either meant he had been here long enough to become part of the landscape or that he had learned to look that way. "Come inside," he said. "I have coffee." The cottage was one large room with a sleeping loft above, every surface organized with the precision of a man who lives alone and has made his peace with it. Bookshelves, naturally, field guides, ornithological journals, monographs in English and Dutch and what I thought was German, a spotting scope on a tripod at the large window facing the lake, a desk covered with notebooks in a small, very regular hand, and on the wall facing the door, a large detailed map of the lake and surrounding terrain, annotated in pencil with what I took to be bird sighting locations and dates, covering what appeared to be several years of patient observation. I sat in the offered chair. He poured coffee from a pot on the wood stove and sat across from me and waited with the patience of his profession. "How long did you know Vasich?" I asked. 6 years, he said. "I came here originally for a summer study, loon populations on the mountain lakes. I stayed." He paused. "Drav had something to do with that. We found each other useful. Two men who prefer observation to conversation tend to get along." "What did you talk about when you did talk?" A slight smile. "Animals, mostly. Migration patterns, the intelligence of corvids, whether a cheetah could be trained to a specific human being with enough patience and consistency." He said this last item in the same tone as the others and watched me register it. "He told you about the cheetah," I said. "Are thorning it my money." "He showed me Zora," Oost said. 3 months ago. She was in the woods behind his house. He had been working with her for 2 years. I think she is the finest thing he ever accomplished." He paused. "Where is she now?" "We don't know," I said. "She wasn't at the house when we arrived." He nodded slowly. "She will come when she's ready. She does things in her own time." He looked at his coffee. "Drav said she would go to Wolfe, that she had been oriented toward him," he said, using Wolfe's habits and scent and the sound of his voice on the recordings. 2 years of work." He paused. He was very serious about it. I wrote this down. Recordings. I had not known about recordings. "What recordings?" "Drav had recordings of Wolfe's voice. Radio appearances, I think. A lecture at Columbia some years ago. He played them for Zora regularly as part of her conditioning." Oost looked at me with the pale, focused eyes. "You understand? Drav was not a sentimental man. Everything he did had a reason. Zora going to Wolfe was not whimsy, it was a plan." "What was the plan?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window the lake was very still, catching the afternoon light. In the distance I could make out the back porch of Vasich's house and the small figure of what I thought was Fritz moving in the kitchen window. "I don't know entirely," Oost said. "Drav kept things in compartments, but in the last month he was different, working more urgently, writing more. He told me once that a man who has held something for too long begins to be held by it in return, and that he had decided it was time to set it down." He paused. "I think he was afraid, not of dying. Drav was not afraid of dying. Afraid that what he was holding would die with him before he could pass it on." "The document," I said. Oost looked at me carefully. "He mentioned a document to you." "Not to me, to others." I watched his face. "Did he mention it to you?" A pause. The pause of a man deciding. "He told me there was a record," he said finally. "A signed witness account from 1944. Something that happened during the war in occupied Yugoslavia. He said it implicated a man who was still alive and still respected and who had built that respect on the grave of what he had done." He looked at his hands. He said he had been waiting for the right moment to use it, the right person to give it to. "Wolfe," I said. "I believe so, yes." I sat with that for a moment. Outside a bird landed on the dock railing, small, dark, with a white breast, and Oost's eyes went to it automatically, registered it, returned to me. "Mr. Oost," I said, "where were you Monday night and Tuesday morning?" He had been waiting for it, you could tell. "Here," he said. "I was here all night. I rise early. I was at the window with the scope by 5:15. I observed the lake from 5:15 until approximately 6:40, when I heard Roy Peck's outboard motor." He paused. "I saw nothing on the lake between 5:15 and 6:40 that was inconsistent with a normal morning." "You were watching the lake with a spotting scope from 5:15, I said. I said, "Yes, and you saw nothing." "I saw Roy Peck's boat. I saw the light come up. I saw 3 mergansers on the north end." He met my eyes. "I did not see a body in the water, Mr. Goodwin, because when I was watching the lake there was no body in the water, which means either Vasich entered the water after 6:40 or he entered it before 5:15, when it was too dark for me to observe." I looked at him. He looked back with the steady patience of a man who has said what he has to say and is content to let it sit. "That's a very precise alibi," I said. "I am a precise man," he said. "It's a professional requirement." I closed my notebook. "One more question. The canoe on your dock, do you use it regularly?" "Almost daily. I cover the whole lake." "Were you on the lake Sunday night or Monday night?" "Sunday I was in Albany," he said. "I drove back Monday afternoon." He paused. "I was not on the lake Monday night." I looked at the canoe through the window. Light aluminum, as I had noted. It would move very quietly on a calm lake at night. It would leave very little wake. "Thank you for the coffee," I said. He walked me to the dock. I untied the painter and settled into the rowboat and fitted the oars. "Mr. Goodwin," he said as I pushed off. I looked up. "Drav trusted Wolfe completely," he said. "Whatever he was holding, whatever he planned to do with it, Wolfe was the conclusion of that plan. Not a step in it." He paused. "I think you should know that." I rowed back across the lake and thought about what a precise man who rises at 5:15 and watches the water through a scope had not seen, and what that meant about when a man had died, and how. Peter Strand was waiting for me on the back porch when I got back. He had arranged himself with some care, standing at the railing, looking at the lake, hands in his coat pockets, the posture of a man who wants to appear to have arrived there by accident. He turned when I came up the dock steps with the easy timing of a man who has been watching me row across the lake for 20 minutes. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "I was hoping we might talk." "I've been hoping the same thing," I said. "Shall we go inside?" "I'd rather stay out here if you don't mind." "Was mind someone at prefer?" I didn't mind. Out here meant no Fritz, no Wolfe, no possibility of being overheard from the kitchen window. It also meant no notebook without him noticing, so I put my hands in my coat pockets and kept my memory sharp. "I want to be straightforward with you," Strand said. "I want to be straightforward with you," Strand said. "In my experience, when people begin sentences that way, the sentence that follows is rarely straightforward." But I said, "Please." "I did not come here only about the estate," he said. He was looking at the lake. "Drav telephoned me 3 weeks ago. He said he had a document he intended to make public in the next 60 days, and he wanted legal guidance on the safest way to do it, how to authenticate it, who to approach, how to protect himself and anyone he gave it to." He paused. "I advised him to go to a federal attorney. He said he didn't trust federal attorneys. He said there was one man he trusted, and he was handling it his own way." "Wolfe," I said. Strand glanced at me. "He didn't say the name, but yes, I believe so." He turned back to the lake. "I drove up because I was concerned about the document, about the circumstances of Drave's death, and because I wanted to know whether the document had survived." "Had it?" I said. He looked at me directly for the first time in the conversation. "When I arrived Wednesday morning, the study door was unlocked. I went in. The desk had been, not searched exactly, but looked through, by someone who knew what they were looking for and didn't find it." He paused. "There was an envelope in the bottom drawer, empty. The flap had been resealed, and you left it there." "I left it exactly as I found it." He held my gaze. "I am telling you this because I want Wolfe to know that I am not the person who went through that desk. Someone else was in this house before I arrived." I looked at him for a long moment. He had good eyes, steady, with the practiced transparency of a man who has learned that the best camouflage is apparent openness. The question was whether the apparent openness was real. "Who knew about the document besides you?" I asked. Drav was careful, but he had been working on this for years. Careful men make contact with other people along the way. Researchers, witnesses, people who can verify what they know. He paused. "And the man the document implicates presumably knew that Drav had it, or suspected. That kind of knowledge tends to create its own pressure." "The man the document implicates," I said. "Do you know who it is?" Strand was quiet for a moment. The lake held the late afternoon light. Somewhere in the woods above the house, a branch cracked. Wildlife I registered automatically, something moving through the undergrowth. "Drav told me enough," Strand said, "that I understood why he was afraid, and why he was right to be." He turned from the railing. "I'll tell Wolfe directly, if he'll see me." "This evening," I said, "after dinner." He nodded and went inside. I stayed on the porch for a moment, looking at the lake, running through what I had and what I didn't have, and where the spaces were. A document, a dead man, a resealed envelope, a lawyer who arrived 12 hours early and now claimed innocence, an ornithologist with a precise alibi and a canoe that moved quietly on still water, a daughter who was not surprised the dogs had found their way south, an unknown man who visited 3 times in the past year, always at night, and a young man, or youngish, whose voice Ruth Halsey had heard through a closed study door the Monday before Vasich died. I had not yet found a place for the young man. He would need one. I found Wolfe in the main room with Marta Vasich. This surprised me. Wolfe conducting an interview without my presence was not standard operating procedure. I stood in the hallway and listened, which was not elegant but was necessary. Marta was speaking. Didn't know the specifics. He never told me the specifics, but I knew he was afraid in the last few weeks. He started locking the study, which he had never done before. He asked me not to tell anyone I was coming up to visit. When did you visit? Wolfe asked. 2 weekends ago. I stayed 3 days. Did you see anything that concerned you? A pause. There was a man. I didn't meet him. Father said he was a colleague, but I saw him from upstairs, crossing the yard toward the dock late at night. He was young, 30 or so, dark coat. I wrote it on the inside of my wrist with the pen I keep in my breast pocket for emergencies. Did your father seem comfortable with this man's presence? Wolfe asked. No, Marta said. And then, more quietly, Father was many things, but he was not a good liar. He told me the man was a colleague, and his face said something else. What did his face say? Another pause. Longer. That the man was necessary, not welcome, necessary. Like a medicine you take because you need it, and not because it helps. There was a silence. I heard Wolfe shift in whatever chair he had commandeered. Miss Vasich, he said, your father sent the dogs to me, not to the police, not to a federal agency, to me. Do you know why? Because he trusted you, she said. And because, she stopped. Because? Because he thought you would understand what was at stake without having to be told all of it. He said once that Nero Wolfe was the only man he knew who could hold a truth in his hands without needing to do anything with it until exactly the right moment. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. He was generous, Wolfe said. In that assessment and in others. A pause. I am sorry, Miss Vasich, that I did not come while he was living. I have no excuse that would satisfy either of us, so I will not offer one. I heard her stand, the sound of her chair on the stone floor. Find who did it, she said. It was not an instruction. It was not a plea either. It was something between the straightforward statement of a woman who has decided what she believes and is not interested in anything less. Her footsteps crossed the room and I moved down the hall before she reached the door. Dinner was roast chicken, which Fritz had managed with the mountain kitchen and his own determination, and roasted vegetables, and bread that he had baked that afternoon because Fritz considers store bread a personal insult. We ate at the long kitchen table, the 4 of us, Wolfe, Fritz, Marta, and myself, with Strand having taken a tray to his room, which suited everyone. Ajax was under the table. Cato had positioned himself in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall. Juno sat beside my chair and occasionally rested her long jaw on the table edge and looked at my chicken with an expression of patient optimism that I found difficult to ignore. Wolfe ate with full attention, which he always does, and said nothing about the case until the plates were cleared and Fritz brought coffee. Then he looked at me. The ornithologist, he said. Interesting, I said. Precise. He has an alibi for early Tuesday morning, but not for Monday night, when, if Halsey's right about the study, and I think she is, the second visitor was in this house. He knew about Zora, Wolfe said. Yes. He knew about the recordings too. Vasich played recordings of your voice to condition her toward you. Wolfe looked at his coffee cup. He said nothing for a moment. And Strand claims he found the envelope already tampered with. Says Vasich called him 3 weeks ago about authentication and distribution of the document. Says he'll tell you the rest directly. Then he will, Wolfe said. At 9 o'clock. He pushed back from the table. And the young man in the dark coat. I told him about Marta's account, matching what I had heard through the door and what she had told me separately on the porch after dinner. She had confirmed it when I asked, without asking how I knew to ask. 30 or so, dark coat, using the dock late at night. Vasich's face said necessary, not welcome. Wolfe folded his hands on the table. A man who visits at night and uses the dock is either coming across the water or arriving and departing by boat to avoid using the road. The road can be watched. The water is harder to watch. He paused. Unless you have a spotting scope and rise at 5:15. We looked at each other. Oost knew about the document, I said. He knew enough, Wolfe said. The question is whether his knowledge was Vasich's gift or his own acquisition. He stood. "I will see Strand at 9. In the meantime, the shed." The shed, the tool shed at the dock. If a boat came to that dock at night and tied up, it did not tie to a cleat, too visible, too permanent. It would use a line through a gap in the planking or around one of the dock posts. Look for wear marks, fresh rope fibers, anything that indicates repeated use by a vessel that did not belong there. He went to the main room to read until 9 o'clock. The shed by lamplight was a different place than it had been in the afternoon. I went over every inch of the dock posts and the dock's underside where I could reach with the lamp held low and close. On the third post from the end, below the waterline, when the water was at its current level, I found what I was looking for. 2 loops of wear in the wood, 3 inches apart, where a rope had been tied and untied repeatedly over a period of time long enough to compress the grain, recent enough that the compression was pale against the weathered wood around it, old enough that it had happened more than once or twice. Someone had been tying up to Vassich dock regularly and doing it below the visible line of the dock's edge. I measured the distance between the wear loops, 12 inches. The painter of the aluminum canoe on Oost's dock was fixed to a bow cleat. A canoe's bow cleat is typically set about 12 inches from center. I did not conclude anything. I noted the measurement and went back inside. At 9 o'clock, Peter Strand sat across from Nero Wolfe in the main room and told him the name of the man the 1944 document implicated. I was in the room. I wrote the name down. It was a name I recognized, which meant Wolfe certainly recognized it, and the recognition explained several things about why Drav Varsich had been afraid and why the young man in the dark coat had been necessary rather than welcome, and why a body had ended up 40 yards from a dock in flat, still water. Wolfe listened to everything Strand said without expression. When Strand finished, Wolfe thanked him, told him to remain available, and sent him to bed. Then he sat in the main room in the dark for a long time. I brought him beer and sat across from him, and did not ask questions, because there are times when Nero Wolfe needs to be in the same room as what he knows, and not be required to talk about it. And 11 years had taught me to recognize those times. Cato came in after a while and lay down beside Wolfe's chair. The lake outside was completely dark and completely still. Tomorrow was the 4th day. In the morning, at dawn, the tree line above the house would offer up something that neither of us was expecting, though one of us, I think, had been waiting for it. Chapter 5. The 5th morning. I want to be precise about the timing because it matters. I came downstairs at 5:50. The house was dark except for the kitchen where the wood stove had been banked overnight and threw a low orange light through its grate. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the lake, which was invisible, just blackness where the water was, and a slightly lighter blackness where the sky began, and the mountains between them as a darker mass that you knew rather than saw. At 6:10 I heard Wolfe's step on the stairs. This was, in my experience, an event without precedent. Nero Wolfe does not come downstairs before 8 o'clock under any circumstances that do not involve the building being on fire, and even then I suspect he would want to finish the chapter. I turned from the window and watched him come into the kitchen in his robe and his slippers, moving with the careful deliberateness of a large man navigating unfamiliar geography in the dark. He did not acknowledge me. He went to the stove, located the coffee, poured a cup with the concentration of a man performing a task he has not done for himself in some years, and took it to the back door. He stood in the open doorway in his robe in the cold October dark with his coffee, and looked at the lake. I said nothing. I turned back to the window and drank my own coffee, and let him have whatever this was. After perhaps 5 minutes he went out onto the porch. I heard the big wooden chair creak under his weight. Then silence, except for the lake's small sounds, water against the dock, something moving in the reeds at the shore's edge, the distant call of a bird I could not identify. I thought about going out. I decided against it. At 6:40 the sky began to show its intentions in the east, a thin grey line above the mountain ridge that widened slowly and without drama into the kind of dawn that the Adirondacks produce in October, cold and clear and absolute, the light arriving like a fact rather than an event. I refilled my coffee and went to the back door and looked out. Wolfe was in his chair, both hands around his cup, looking at the far shore. He was very still. Cato was beside him, also looking at the far shore. And for a moment the similarity of their posture, the complete absence of restlessness, the quality of attention that was not tense but simply total, was so precise that I felt I was looking at 2 versions of the same thing. Then I looked at the tree line above the house. She was there. She had been there, I think, for some time, sitting at the edge of the birch trees on the slope above the back of the house, above and to the left, perhaps 40 yards up the hill, in the particular stillness of a cheetah who has decided to observe something and has all the patience in the world for the observing. In the early light she was a shape more than a form, tawny grey against the pale birch trunks, spots resolving as the light improved from suggestion to fact. She was looking at Wolfe. I stood in the doorway and did not move and did not speak. Wolfe had not seen her yet. He was looking at the lake. Then something, some shift in Cato perhaps, some microscopic change in the dog's attention, made him turn his head and look up the slope. He saw her. He did not move. He did not speak. He set his coffee cup down on the arm of the chair with great care and then folded his hands in his lap and looked at her with the same quality of attention he brings to a difficult passage in Montaigne or a particularly intricate piece of deductive reasoning, complete, unhurried, without agenda. Zora looked back at him. I do not know how long it lasted because I stopped tracking time. The light kept improving. The lake below them both went from black to grey to the deep cold blue of an Adirondack morning. A heron crossed the water from south to north with the slow authority of something that has been crossing water since before there were people to watch it. Then Zora stood. She stretched, the full, luxurious, vertebra by vertebra stretch of a cat who has been still for a long time, and stepped out of the tree line and came down the slope. She did not come quickly. She came the way she did everything, which was at her own pace and with the clear understanding that the pace was hers to set. She came diagonally across the wet grass, unhurried, and stopped 12 feet from the porch. She sat. Wolfe looked at her. She looked at Wolfe. Cato beside Wolfe's chair turned his head and looked at her, and then looked away again, which seemed to be his version of an introduction. Zora's gaze moved to Cato briefly, and then returned to Wolfe with the focused attention of someone who has been pointed toward a destination for a long time, and has finally arrived at it, and is now doing the work of deciding what it means. I went back inside. I am not a sentimental man as a rule. I have been in this business long enough to have had most of the sentiment worked out of me by repeated contact with what people actually do to each other when they think no one is watching. But I went back inside because some things are not mine to watch, and because I understood, standing in that doorway, that what was happening on that porch in the cold October light was between two creatures who had been prepared for each other by a dead man's 2 years of patient, loving work, and that it did not need a witness. I went upstairs and woke Fritz and told him to make breakfast. I want to be equally precise about what I found in the study that morning, because this is where the case turned, though I did not know it yet. Wolfe had given me a list the previous evening, before Strand's meeting. He wanted the study searched, not for the document, which he had largely concluded was no longer in the house, but for evidence of what it had contained and what had been done with it. Specifically, any secondary copy, any notes Vasich had made about its contents, any correspondence relating to its authentication or distribution, any indication of where Vasich might have moved it when he realized the study was no longer secure. I spent 2 hours in that room after breakfast. The books first. Not reading them, checking them. Pages pressed together over time acquire a memory of what has been pressed between them, and a man hiding something small in a room full of books is not being clever, he is being human. Nothing in the books, though I found 3 pages of handwritten notes tucked into a German-language ornithological monograph that I set aside for Wolfe. Then the furniture. I went over the desk again, more carefully. The drawers, the underside, the back where the drawbacks meet the frame. Nothing new beyond what we had found. The walls. The drawings, the photographs. I took each one down and looked at the back, replaced it, moved to the next. Nothing. Then the floor. The study floor was wide plank pine, old, with the gaps between planks that old wood floors develop over decades of expansion and contraction. I went over it on my hands and knees with a flashlight and a thin letter knife from the desk drawer, checking each gap. At the far corner, behind the desk and partially under it, I found a plank that did not sound the same as the ones beside it when I pressed it. Hollow beneath where the others were solid. The plank was held by 4 square head screws, old but recently turned. The slots showed fresh bright scratches in the old black oxidation. Someone had been into this space not long ago. I got the screws out with the letter knife blade and lifted the plank. The space beneath was perhaps 4 inches deep and 8 inches wide, running between 2 floor joists. It was empty, but it had not always been empty, and had not been empty for long. At the near end where something had rested against the joist, there were 2 parallel compression marks in the old wood dust, the edges of something flat and rigid, perhaps a 1/4 inch thick. The document, or the envelope that contained it, had been here, recently removed. At the far end of the space, caught on a rough fiber of wood where the joist met the subfloor, was a thread. Single thread, about 1 inch long, dark blue, wool or wool blend. I put it in my notebook between 2 pages and screwed the plank back down and went to find Wolfe. He was on the back porch again. Zora was still there. She had not, as best I could determine, moved closer than the 12 feet she had established in the early morning, but she had shifted her position so that she was now angled slightly toward the porch rather than directly facing it, which in cheetah terms I was learning to read as a meaningful distinction. She was grooming one forepaw with the precise, repetitive attention of a cat who is outwardly occupied and inwardly watching everything. Wolfe was reading. He had, at some point in the morning, located a coat and boots and a better chair, this last being an operation I could not fully reconstruct but which had evidently involved Fritz, and he was reading with the focused serenity of a man who has decided that being outdoors in October in the mountains is tolerable provided he has a good book, adequate coffee, and a cheetah within his field of vision. I gave him the thread. I described the floor compartment, the compression marks, the evidence of recent removal. He held the thread up to the light. "Dark blue wool," he said. "Yes, Peter Strand wears charcoal suits," I said. "Grey, not blue." "He does. Oost wears canvas and wool." "What color wool?" I thought back to the cottage, the shirt he had been wearing. "Dark green." "Ajax," Wolfe said. I looked at Ajax, who was patrolling the perimeter of the back porch with the focused industry of a dog who has decided that perimeter security is his contribution to the household. "What about him?" "Yesterday evening while you were at the dock," Wolfe said. "Ajax went into the study. He does his circuits and he went in and came out again in less time than the room requires, if you are simply passing through. He had been in that corner." I looked at the thread and then at Ajax. "You think he found the compartment?" "I think he has known about the compartment since we arrived," Wolfe said. "It would have smelled of Vasich, of something important to Vasich, handled frequently, invested with meaning. Dogs raid importance through scent and repetition and the emotional state of the people they are bonded to." Ajax knew that corner mattered. He paused. "The question the thread answers is not who removed the document. The question it answers is when." I followed this. "The thread is from someone's clothing. If it was caught in the rough wood when the document was removed, it came from whoever removed it, and it is not charcoal and not dark green," Wolfe said. I thought about every person who had been in that house since Vasich died. Marta in dark trousers and a grey wool sweater, Strand in his Albany suit, Ruth Halsey in a brown wool coat, Oost, whom I had met across the lake and who had not been in the house to my knowledge, and one person I had not yet accounted for in the study, one person whose clothing I was now trying to remember precisely. "The deputy," I said. "Dunbar's deputy. Carver. He was in the house the morning the body was found." Wolfe looked at me. "Describe him." I had not met Carver. Dunbar had mentioned him, a young man not present that morning. I had not pushed on it because I had more immediately pressing things. A young deputy. Dunbar's words, my deputy, a young man named Carver. "I haven't met him," I said. "He wasn't at the office when I went." "On the morning a man is found drowned in his jurisdiction," Wolfe said, "a deputy would normally be present at his desk, unless he had a reason not to be," I said. "Find him," Wolfe said, "today. Do not telephone first." He went back to his book. Zora, from her 12 feet of sovereign distance, watched him read with the focused attention of someone who is still deciding something important, but is in no particular hurry about it. I drove into Heron Lake after lunch and went to the municipal building. Dunbar was there. Carver was not. "Day off," Dunbar said, with the flat delivery of a man who had prepared for this question. "Where does he live?" Dunbar looked at me for a moment. In the past 2 days, something had shifted in his manner. The comfortable competence had developed a fault line, the way a road develops a crack in the first frost, and you know that by spring it will be something more serious. He was a man who had stopped looking too soon and was beginning to understand that this was going to cost him something. "County Road 7, he said. "White House, Red Barn. You can't miss it." "How long has he worked for you?" 8 months. "Where did he come from?" Dunbar looked at his desk. "He came with good references," he said. "Albany." I drove to County Road 7. The White House with the Red Barn was there as described, set back from the road behind a stand of maples that were holding their last red leaves against the October wind. I parked in the road and walked up the drive and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again and waited and looked at the barn, which had its doors closed and a padlock on the hasp that was new, bright steel against the weathered wood. I looked at the house windows and saw no movement. I walked around the side of the house and looked at the back. A blue wool jacket hung on a peg beside the back door. I stood and looked at it for a moment. Dark blue wool. The jacket of a man who had dressed in plain clothes to do something he did not want to be recognized doing, and had not yet thought to dispose of the evidence because he had not known anyone was looking for it, or he had known and decided the jacket was not the problem. I went back to the car and sat and thought about a young deputy from Albany who had arrived 8 months ago with good references and had inserted himself into a small mountain community near a lake where a man was keeping something that powerful people wanted buried. 8 months. Long enough to establish himself, long enough to earn Dunbar's routine trust, long enough to learn the lake, the house, the dock, the habits of a careful man who locked his study but still left his boat accessible and his property open, long enough to be useful to someone in Albany who needed eyes on Drav Vasich. I drove back to the house and found Wolfe on the porch in the long late afternoon light and told him about the jacket. He listened. He looked at the lake. He looked at Zora, who had moved for the first time since the morning, to within 8 feet of the porch. Progress, I noted, measured in 4-foot increments. Carver is not the principal, Wolfe said. He is a mechanism. Someone placed him here. Someone directed him. Someone told him what to look for and when to act. He paused. The name Strand gave us last night. Find out how that name connects to Albany. Find out who in Albany has reason to protect it. That's a telephone call to Lon Cohen, I said. Then make it. From where? The nearest telephone I trust is Delhi. Drive to the nearest town with a drugstore that has a pay telephone outside, Wolfe said. Take Ajax. He needs the exercise, and so Archie do you. I looked at Ajax, who was on his 4th circuit of the porch perimeter, and received this news by stopping and looking at me with an expression of focused readiness. He's going to want to ride in the front, I said. Presumably, Wolfe said, and went back to his book. Lon Cohen, who handles the city desk at the Gazette, and who is my primary source for information that moves faster than the public record, picked up on the second ring. I was at a payphone outside a hardware store in a town called Cedarville, 8 miles south of Heron Lake, with Ajax sitting in the passenger seat of the Buick looking out the windshield with the professional attention of a dog who considers himself on duty. I gave Lon the name Strand had given us. I told him what I needed: Albany connections, political connections, any connection to wartime intelligence work or Yugoslav partisan operations, or anything that rhymed with occupied territory in 1943 and 1944. Lon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Archie, where are you calling from? A payphone in the mountains. Does Wolfe know what he's got hold of? He will by tomorrow, I said. What do you know? What Lon knew took 11 minutes to tell, and confirmed 3 things I had suspected, and introduced 1 thing I had not, which was the name of a law firm in Albany that had represented the name Strand had given us for 30 years, and which had a junior partner, young, ambitious, reportedly willing to be useful in ways that senior partners preferred not to know about, whose name I wrote down next to Carver's in my notebook. I thanked Lon and told him there would be something in this for the Gazette when it resolved, which there would be, and hung up. I sat in the car for a moment in the hardware store parking lot with Ajax beside me and the mountains around us going dark in the early evening cold, and thought about a man who had kept a truth for 11 years and had decided finally that the moment had come to release it, who had spent 2 years preparing an animal to carry his most important message, who had built the conditions for justice with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment is not found but made, and who had been killed for it by a young man in a blue jacket who had been placed in his county 8 months ago by people who understood finally that the moment was coming and intended to stop it. I started the car. Ajax looked at me. Let's go tell Wolfe, I said. He turned back to the windshield, and we drove north into the dark. Chapter 6. The conversation with Marta. I got back to the house at 7:40. Fritz had held dinner, which he communicated through the specific quality of his silence when I came through the kitchen door. The silence of a man who has made something that peaks at 7 o'clock and is now managing its decline with professional dignity. I apologized without explaining, because explaining would have taken longer than eating, and we sat down. Wolfe listened to everything I had brought back from the payphone while working through Fritz's blanquette de veau, which had survived the delay better than Fritz's equanimity. He asked 2 questions. The first was the name of the junior partner at the Albany law firm. The second was how long that firm had represented the name Strand had given us. 30 years, I said. Since before the war. Wolfe set down his fork. He picked it up again. He ate for a moment in the focused silence that means he is arranging things. The mechanism is clear enough, he said finally. A man of position and reputation who has spent 30 years building both on the foundation of what he did in 1944, who learned at some point in the past year that Vasich was moving toward disclosure, who engaged a law firm already in his employ to handle the problem through a junior partner willing to be useful in ways that don't appear in billing records. He paused. That junior partner identifies and places Carver. Carver establishes himself in Heron Lake. Carver monitors Vasich, gains access to the house and the dock, and reports back on whether the document can be located and removed quietly. And when it couldn't be removed quietly, I said. Vasich was killed, Wolfe said, and Carver either removed the document afterward or failed to find it and is still looking. He looked at me. You said the compartment was empty, recently emptied. The compression marks were fresh. The wood dust had been disturbed recently. Then the document was removed either by Vasich himself before he died or by someone after. If by Vasich, where did he put it? If by someone after, Carver is the most probable candidate, and he either has it or has passed it on. We ate in silence for a moment. From the main room I could hear Ix's systematic patrol, the soft rhythm of his circuit marking the edges of the house. There is a third possibility, I said. Wolfe looked at me. Vasich moved the document himself and told someone where it was going, I said. Not where he hid it, where it was ultimately going. Who was going to receive it? Marta, Wolfe said. Or Oost, I said. Or Marta, Wolfe said again, with the quiet finality that means he has already been there and found what he was looking for. I will speak with her tonight. It was 9 o'clock when Wolfe settled into the main room's largest chair, which Fritz had supplemented with a cushion from the bedroom in an act of quiet devotion, and asked me to bring Marta Vasich. She came without hesitation. She had been in her father's study, she said, reading, just reading, going through his journals from the years before she was born, trying to know him in the way you can only know a person after they are gone, when the performance of being a parent has ended and what remains is the record of who they were. She sat across from Wolfe in the chair I placed for her and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Kato was in the corner. Juno was at my feet. Zora, and this was new, this had not happened before, was in the room. She had come in from the porch during dinner and installed herself along the far wall with the composed authority of an animal who has decided that inside is now within her territory and is not interested in negotiating the point. Several of the household had noticed. None of us had commented. Wolfe looked at Marta for a moment. Your father moved the document, he said, before he died. I believe he told you where it went. Marta looked at him steadily. Why do you believe that? Because he trusted you, Wolfe said. Because the dogs were trained to come to me, which was his plan for justice, but he would not have left his daughter without an understanding of what she might be asked. Because you arrived here within hours of his death and have been waiting, not grieving, waiting, for something to resolve itself. He paused, and because when I told you last night that I was sorry I had not come while he was living, you did not say it didn't matter, or offer any of the usual consolations. You said find who did it. That is the response of a woman who knows what was at stake and has decided to see it through. Marta was quiet for a long moment. Juno lifted her head and looked at her. Just looked, with the focused attention she brings to people she is reading, and then rested her chin back on the floor. He called me, Marta said, 3 weeks ago. He said he needed to tell me something in case anything happened to him. He said he had been keeping a record, a signed account from 1944, his own signature and 2 others, of something that had been done by a man who was now prominent and protected. He said he had been waiting for the right time and the right way to make it public, and that he had found both. She paused. He said he was going to give it to Nero Wolfe, that Wolfe would know what to do with it, and how to protect the people involved in doing it. But he didn't give it to me directly, Wolfe said. Wallace Weathers stare. He didn't have the chance, she said. Or, I don't know. Maybe he wanted to give it to you himself, in person. Maybe that was important to him. She looked at her hands. He said if anything happened before he could reach you, I was to give it to you directly. No intermediary, no post, no lawyers. Put it in your hands. The room was very quiet. Outside the lake made its small sounds against the dock and the shore. Miss Vasich, Wolfe said. Do you have it? She reached into the pocket of her wool sweater and withdrew an envelope. Letter-sized, manila, sealed. She held it for a moment, one moment, just one, and then leaned forward and placed it on the low table between her chair and Wolfe's. He hid it in the floorboards, she said. He moved it the Sunday before he died. He called me that night and told me where it was and said if he didn't call me again by the following Thursday I should come up and get it. She paused. He didn't call me by Thursday, so you came Friday, I said. Friday morning. She looked at the envelope. I found it exactly where he said. I've had it since Friday, and no one knows you have it, Wolfe said. No one. Wolfe looked at the envelope. He did not reach for it. Did you read it? No. She looked at him directly. It wasn't mine to read. Wolfe picked up the envelope. He held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it with an expression I had no good word for. Not quite grief, not quite resolution, somewhere between them in a territory that doesn't get named because most people don't spend much time there. Then he set it on the table beside his chair and looked at Marta. "Your father," he said, "was the best man I have known who was not in this room. I want you to understand that I am not offering you a sentiment. I am making a statement of fact to which I have given considerable thought and which I would not revise." He paused. "I failed him by allowing 11 years to pass without contact. I will not explain the reasons because they do not excuse the result. What I can tell you is that the work of these years, the animals, the document, the patience with which he assembled the conditions for justice, was precisely what I would have expected of him. He was always more thorough than the situation required. It was his great quality, and occasionally his great inconvenience to those around him." Something shifted in Marta's face. Not breaking down, she was not that kind of woman, and I mean that as high praise. Just a shift, like a window opening briefly in a stone wall. "He talked about you," she said. "He never explained the history, but he talked about you the way you talk about someone who changed the direction of something important. I always thought I'd meet you while he was alive." She paused. "I'm glad you came, even now, especially now." Wolfe nodded once. It was not a small nod. After Marta went to bed, I sat across from Wolfe in the main room with the envelope on the table between us. Zora had not moved from the far wall. She was watching Wolfe with the settled attention of an animal that has made a decision and is no longer in the process of making it. "Carver," I said. "Yes." Wolfe had not touched the envelope since setting it down. He came for the document. He found the compartment empty. He did not know Marta had taken it and does not know she is here with it. He paused. "He will try again. He may have already communicated to Albany that he failed and is awaiting further instruction. Or he has decided on his own initiative to wait and watch." "He could be watching the house now," I said. "He could be," Wolfe agreed. He did not seem disturbed by this. "What he cannot do is move openly. He is a deputy in a county where a man has officially drowned accidentally. Any action he takes against us exposes not only himself but the people who placed him here. He is a mechanism operating past the point of its usefulness, and that is a dangerous position for a mechanism." He looked at the envelope. "We will move tomorrow. Not before I have spoken with everyone." "The sitting room," I said. "Yes, tomorrow evening." He finally reached for the envelope. He turned it over once, looked at the seal, set it down again. "But first I need to know something that only one person in this house can tell me." I waited. "Oost," he said. "His alibi for early Tuesday morning is the spotting scope. He was watching the lake from 5:15. He saw nothing inconsistent with a normal morning." He looked at me. "Why was he watching the lake at 5:15? He said he rises early. Habit of the work." "In October," Wolfe said, "on a mountain lake, at 5:15, there is not sufficient light for useful bird observation until 6 o'clock at the earliest. A man whose professional life depends on observing birds would know this precisely." He paused. "He was not watching for birds at 5:15. He was watching for something else." I sat with that. "He knew," I said slowly, "or suspected. He knew something was going to happen that night or that morning, and he wanted to see it. Or he wanted to ensure he could say he had seen nothing," Wolfe said, "which is a different thing entirely and points in a different direction." "You think he's involved?" "I think he knew more than a neighbor should know, and was at his scope at an hour that makes no ornithological sense," Wolfe said. "Which is not involvement. It may be something more interesting." He looked at Zora. "He told you Vasich trained her using recordings of my voice?" "Yes." "He knew about the document. He knew about Zora's conditioning. He knew about the plan." Wolfe was quiet for a moment. "Vasich kept things in compartments," Marta told us. "He did not give information without purpose." "What purpose did Oost serve in knowing these things?" I thought about it. "Back up," I said. "If something happened to Vasich before the plan was complete, before the dogs could reach you, before Marta could retrieve the document, Oost knew enough to continue it." "A secondary mechanism," Wolfe said. "Of Vasich's own design, not anyone else's." He nodded slowly. "Which means Oost's presence at the scope at 5:15 was not complicity. It was vigil. He knew something was wrong, had known for some time, and was watching because he could not do anything else and could not bear to do nothing." The room was quiet. The fire had burned down in the grate, and the room was cooling, and neither of us moved to add wood. "He didn't see anything," I said, "because Vasich was already dead. He'd been dead for hours." "Yes," Wolfe said. "Which means Carver acted before midnight, before the lake was visible even by starlight." He looked at the table. "A man who knows the lake and knows the dock and has a boat and 8 months of practiced patience. He paused. And now that man is missing from his office, and his house is empty. He's running, I said. He has what he came for, or he doesn't, Wolfe said. If he has it, he is gone, and the document is with him, and we are in a different kind of trouble. If he doesn't have it, he looked at the envelope, then he is still here, waiting for another opportunity, watching this house. Should I call Dunbar? Not yet. Wolfe pushed himself to his feet. Tomorrow evening, after the sitting room. Dunbar will have the full picture by then and will be sufficiently embarrassed about his deputy to be cooperative. He picked up the envelope and looked at me. Put this somewhere that is not your room and not mine. I thought for a moment. Fritz, I said. Wolfe almost smiled. Yes, he said. Fritz? I knocked on Fritz's door and woke him, and explained without explaining fully, and gave him the envelope, and told him to put it in his provision crate, under the cured meats. Fritz received this information with the equanimity of a man who has worked for Nero Wolfe for decades, and has learned that the provision crate is, in fact, exactly the kind of place you hide things when circumstances require it. He took the envelope and said good night, and closed his door. I went to my room and lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling and assembled what we had. We had a name, the man the document implicated, a man of position and long-established reputation, whose position and reputation rested, in ways no one had been allowed to examine, on what he had done in occupied Yugoslavia in 1943 and 1944, and what Drav Vasic had watched him do and had been keeping in signed, witnessed record ever since. We had a mechanism, the junior partner, the law firm, the deputy installed like a piece of furniture in a small mountain county 8 months ago, with patient instructions to find and eliminate a threat. We had a document, in Fritz's provision crate, under the cured meats, in the keeping of the most reliable man I know, and we had almost the shape of the truth. Not all of it yet. There was still the question of the young man in the dark coat, the visitor Marta had seen, the voice Ruth Halsey had heard through the study door. He was not Carver. Marta had said 30 or so, and Carver, from Dunbar's description, was 26. He was not Ost. He was someone I had not yet placed, and Wolfe had not yet named, and whose role in the week before Vasic's death was still a dark space in an otherwise legible picture. I would need that space filled before tomorrow evening. I went to sleep earlier than usual. The mountains had been doing this, burning off the particular city-bred restlessness that makes it hard to sleep before midnight, replacing it with something older and simpler. I was asleep by 10:30 and did not wake until 5. When I came downstairs at 5:15, which I was doing deliberately, Wolfe was already on the back porch. He had established over these 5 days a routine that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who knew him only from the brownstone. Up before 6, on the porch with coffee in the dark, present for the lake's transition from night to morning, reading through the morning with Zora at her variable distance, working in his mind through the material I brought him, eating with full attention whatever Fritz produced, back to the porch in the afternoon. It was not his brownstone routine, but it was a routine which for Nero Wolfe is everything. Zora was 6 feet from the porch this morning, 4 feet closer than she had been the first morning. Still not close enough to touch, still sovereign, still on her own terms. But 6 feet is not 12 feet, and the difference was not accidental. I sat on the porch steps with my coffee and looked at the lake in the grey pre-dawn and said, I need to find the young man in the dark coat today. You do, Wolfe agreed. I have one avenue I haven't tried, I said. The County Historical Society. Ruth Halsey mentioned Vasic had visitors from there. A Dr. Pembridge, she said. A man who studies local history would know everyone who comes and goes in a small mountain community. If an unfamiliar young man was in the area for several weeks, making visits to Vasic's house, Pembridge would know him, Wolfe said, or know of him. It's a thin thread. It is the only thread, Wolfe said. Pull it. I pulled it. Dr. Elias Pembridge was 72, dry as old paper, and possessed of a memory for local incident that was so comprehensive it had become less like memory and more like a filing system that happened to be housed in a human being. He received me in the Historical Society's 2-room office, above the general store in Heron Lake, with the cautious courtesy of a man who does not get many visitors and has opinions about the ones he gets. I explained that I was working with Nero Wolfe, which he had heard. This was a small community, and that I was looking for information about a young man who had been seen in the area in recent weeks, visiting Vasic's house. Pembridge looked at the ceiling for a moment. Dark coat, he said. That's the one. Came in about 6 weeks ago. Stayed at the Lakeview, which is the only place to stay within 20 miles, for 11 days. He looked at me with the sharp archival eyes. I noticed him because he asked at the general store about Vasic, and Vasic's was a man I was acquainted with. Name he gave at the Lakeview was Thomas Reed. New York City address. Did you speak with him? Once. He came to see me actually. Said he was a graduate student doing research on wartime European history. Asked me whether I knew anything about Yugoslav partisan operations in 1943 and 1944. He paused. I don't. It's not my period. But I thought it was a particular thing to be researching in a small mountain town in upstate New York. And I said so. What did he say? He said he was following a primary source. Pembridge looked at me steadily. I understood him to mean Vasich. I wrote it down. Did he seem threatening? Hostile? No, Pembridge said, with the certainty of a man who has a calibrated sense for such things. He seemed urgent. There's a difference. He had the manner of someone racing against something, not someone pursuing someone. He paused. I had the impression he was trying to help Vasich, not harm him. I drove back to the house with this, and found Wolfe on the porch in the afternoon light with the envelope from Fritz's provision crate open on his knee. He had read it. He was looking at the lake. I told him about Thomas Reed. Wolfe listened. He looked at the open envelope in his lap. A graduate student of wartime European history who came to Vasich as a primary source, he said, who spent 11 days here, visited the house, and whose presence made Vasich's face say necessary rather than welcome. Necessary because Reid could authenticate the document academically, Wolfe said. A private individual producing a 30-year-old signed account needs corroboration, a historian who can verify the names, the dates, the operational context, who can speak to its credibility in the language of scholarship. That is the difference between a document that can be dismissed and a document that cannot be. He paused. Vasich was assembling the conditions for something that could not be undone. He wanted a scholar's voice alongside his own. I looked at the envelope. And then Reedy left. He had what he needed, Wolfe said, or Vasich sent him away, kept him at a safe distance once the danger became clear. He looked at the lake. We need Thomas Reed, today. Lone Cohen can find him. Call him, Wolfe said. Use the pay telephone in Cedarville. Take Ajax. I looked at Ajax, who was immediately at the door. He really does enjoy the car, I said. He enjoys being useful, Wolfe said. It is an excellent quality. We should all be so consistent. Lone found Thomas Reed in 40 minutes, which is why I maintain that relationship regardless of the professional cost. Reed was at Columbia University, a doctoral candidate in European history, and he came to the phone in the department office with the weariness of a young man who has been waiting for something he cannot quite name. I told him who I was, and who I worked for, and that we were in Heron Lake, and that Drav Vasich was dead. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I said his name twice. Then Reed said, I was afraid of that. His voice was young, tightly controlled. He told me if anything happened I should contact Nero Wolfe. I didn't know how. We contacted you, I said. Where is your copy of the document? Another silence. How did you know I have a copy? Because Vasich was thorough, I said. He didn't have one mechanism. He had several. You're one of them. Where is it? Locked in my department office, he said. I've had it for 6 weeks. I've been working on the corroborating material, cross-referencing the names in the account with declassified OSS files, building the scholarly framework. He paused. It's solid. The account is solid. The names, the dates, the operational context, it's all verifiable. I can prove it. You'll have the chance, I said. Can you drive up tomorrow morning? Yes, he said without hesitation. Yes, I can. I gave him the address and told him to tell no one where he was going and to drive carefully and arrive before noon, and I hung up and stood outside the hardware store in Cedarville in the cold afternoon with Ajax sitting in the passenger seat of the Buick watching me through the windshield. I went back to the car and sat behind the wheel. We have everything, I told Ajax. He looked at me with the focused attention he brings to significant statements. Tomorrow evening, I said, in the sitting room. Wolfe closes the case. Ajax turned back to the windshield. We drove north into the darkening afternoon and the mountains came up around us, and the lake appeared below through the trees as we came over the last ridge, dark blue still, holding the last of the light. The house was lit from within. Fritz was in the kitchen. Wolfe was on the porch. Zora was 4 feet from his chair. I sat in the car for a moment and looked at the lit house and the still lake and the 4 feet of grass between a cheetah and the man she had been oriented toward for 2 years, and I thought about Drav Vasich building all of this with patience and love and the absolute certainty that the right moment, properly prepared, will always come. Then I went inside to help Fritz with dinner. Chapter 7, The Sitting Room. Thomas Reed arrived at 11:40 the next morning in a battered green Studebaker that he had driven from Manhattan in just under 4 hours, which told me something about how urgently he had wanted to come. He was 31, lean, with the slightly compressed look of someone who has been spending long hours in library stacks and has forgotten that the world has more than one dimension. He wore a dark blue coat, the coat I confirmed without comment, and carried a leather satchel that he held with the particular care of a man transporting something irreplaceable. He had good eyes, quick and observant, and when I introduced myself he shook my hand and then looked past me toward the house with the expression of someone arriving at the conclusion of something they have been living with for 6 weeks. "Is Wolfe here?" he asked. I asked. "He's on the porch," I said. "Come inside first. Tell me what you have." We sat at the kitchen table, which had become, over the course of this week, the room's operational center. Every significant conversation had happened here or migrated here eventually, as though the kitchen's warmth and Fritz's hovering presence created conditions more conducive to truth than the more formal rooms. Fritz produced coffee without being asked, and then stationed himself at the counter with a studied absence of curiosity that fooled no one. Reader opened the satchel and put 3 things on the table. The first was a manila envelope, twin to the one in Marta's pocket upstairs, same size, same paper, sealed with the same hand. The copy Vasich had made and sent to him 6 weeks ago. The second was a folder, thick, containing typed pages with handwritten annotations in 2 different inks. Reader's research, the corroborating framework he had been building. I flipped through it without reading, dense, detailed, the footnotes running 3 inches deep on some pages. The third was a photograph, black and white, wartime quality, showing 6 men in a mountain setting that could have been Yugoslavia or could have been anywhere in the Balkan range. 5 of the men were in partisan dress, the 6th was not. He was in civilian clothing that was too good for the mountains, and his expression was the expression of a man who considers himself a visitor to circumstances that do not apply to him. He was 40 or so in the photograph. I did not recognize him immediately. Then I looked at the name Reed had written on the back in pencil, and I recognized him. "Where did you get the photograph?" I asked. "The OSS archive," Red said. "Declassified 2 years ago. It was filed under a supply expedition designation, a routine notation about materiel delivery to partisan units in the eastern sector. There was no record of the expedition's outcome." He paused. "Because the outcome was not something anyone wanted on record. And the document tells you the outcome. The document tells you exactly what happened on the 14th of November 1943 in the mountains east of Sarajevo, and who was responsible for the decision that left 23 men dead." He looked at the photograph. Vasich was there. He was 22 years old, a local guide for the partisan unit. He watched it happen and he wrote down what he saw within 48 hours, while the details were precise. And he kept that account for 11 years, waiting for the right moment and the right way to use it. "And now you've built the corroboration," I said. "The declassified files confirm the names of the unit, the date, the location. They confirm the presence of the man in the photograph as an OSS liaison with authorization to direct partisan operations in that sector. They confirm that the unit was listed as missing in action." He paused. "They do not explain what happened to them. The document explains what happened to them." I looked at the photograph again. 50 or so now. A man of position and long-established reputation. "It'll hold up," I said. "It will hold up," Reid said. "I've spent 6 weeks making certain of that." I gathered the 3 items and stood. "Come meet Wolfe." I will not record in full Wolfe's conversation with Reid because some of it concerned the document and what it contained, and the operational details of what had happened in those mountains in 1943, and those details are not mine to set down here. What I will say is that Wolfe listened for 40 minutes without interrupting, which is the highest compliment he pays anyone, and that when Reid finished, Wolfe sat without speaking for a long time looking at the lake through the porch window. Then he said, "You have done this work well." Reid said, "Vasich asked me to." "Yes," Wolfe said. "He had a gift for asking the right people." He looked at the photograph in his hand, the copy Reader had brought, and set it down on the table beside the 2 envelopes, which Marta had surrendered to him that morning without being asked, and looked at all 3 items together. "This evening," he said, 7 o'clock, in the sitting room. "I will want everyone present. Mr. Reid, you will stay." Reedy said he would stay. Wolfe told me to arrange it, and went inside for his afternoon session with the orchids. Or rather, since there were no orchids, sat in the main room with his book for 2 hours in the focused silence that serves the same function. I went to make arrangements. I spent the afternoon on the telephone. The first call was to Sheriff Dunbar. I told him that Nero Wolfe was prepared to present a full account of the circumstances of Drav Vasich's death that evening at 7 o'clock at the house on the lake, and that his presence was required. I used the word required. He started to bristle, and then, in the pause that followed, seemed to think better of it. "Will this involve my deputy?" he asked. "It will involve everything," I said. Another pause. "I'll be there." The second call was to a number Wolfe had given me that morning, a federal attorney in Albany, whose name I had not previously known, but whose direct line Wolfe apparently maintained in the same mental file as other useful utilities. I gave the federal attorney a brief and carefully worded summary of what we had, and told him Wolfe would be in contact by tomorrow, and that time was a factor. He asked 2 questions, both intelligent, and told me he would be available. The third call was not a telephone call. It was a drive, back to the White House on County Road 7, because Wolfe had told me to try again. Carver's house was still empty. The blue jacket was still on its peg by the back door. The padlock on the barn was still new and still closed, but there was something different. A window on the second floor that had been dark both previous times I had been here was now showing the particular quality of interior shadow that means a shade has been drawn from inside, and in the soft mud of the drive, where my car had left prints on my last visit, there were fresh tire tracks overlaying mine. Someone had been here since yesterday. I went back to the car and sat and thought about it. Carver had not run. He was here, or had been here within the past 24 hours. He had not found the document, and he was still in the county, and he was waiting for something, or watching something, or both. What he did not know was that everything was in hand, and that tonight at 7 o'clock it would be over. The question was whether to tell Wolfe immediately, or handle it myself. The answer, in 11 years, has always been the same. I drove back to the house and told Wolfe. He listened. He looked at the lake. "He will be at the house tonight," he said. "You think he'll come here?" "He has been watching this house for 5 days, Wolfe said. "Tonight the cars will be here, Dunbar's, Reed's, Strand's. He will see something has changed. A man who has failed his mission and is running out of time will move toward the action rather than away from it." He paused. "Let him come. It will simplify the conclusion." He would not say anything more about it, which I found less reassuring than he apparently intended. At 6:30 Fritz produced a cold supper. Good bread, pâté, cheese, a salad. Because it was not a dinner evening, it was a working evening, and Fritz understands these distinctions better than most. We ate standing in the kitchen, Wolfe and I and Reed, and then Wolfe straightened his jacket, picked up the 2 envelopes and the photograph from the kitchen counter, and walked to the sitting room. The sitting room was the house's most formal space. Long, with a stone fireplace at one end, a row of windows overlooking the lake at the other, and between them chairs and sofas arranged with the comfortable logic of a room that had hosted conversation for 70 years. Fritz had built a fire. The room was warm and lit, and the windows behind us showed the lake in its last light, the mountains beyond it going dark in gradations of blue. Wolfe surveyed the room, selected a chair that was not quite right and would not be quite right for the entire evening, and sat in it anyway. He put the envelopes and the photograph on the low table beside him. He folded his hands on his stomach, and then the 4 animals arranged themselves. I noticed it because it happened without direction or discussion. Cato came to stand near Wolfe's chair, 6 inches from his left knee, which was his established position. Juno went to the doorway between the sitting room and the hall and sat there, which put her at the point where anyone entering would pass within 2 feet of her. Ajax went to the window which overlooked the front drive, and stood there looking out at the dark, and Zora crossed the room and settled in the far corner to Wolfe's right, angled so that she had sightlines to every chair and every door. Reader watched this happen with the expression of a man seeing something he will be describing to other people for the rest of his life. "Do they always do that?" he asked me quietly. "We'll find out," I said. They arrived between 7 and 7:10. Marta first, who knew what was coming and sat in the chair nearest the fire with her hands in her lap and her face composed in the way I had come to recognize as her resting expression, a composure that was not cold but was earned. Strand next, in his Albany suit, who looked at Reed and then at the envelopes on the table beside Wolfe, and whose own composure underwent a small revision that he controlled quickly. Oost, who had rowed across the lake and come up from the dock with his coat damp at the hem, and who sat in the chair nearest the window and looked at Wolfe with the pale, focused eyes, and said nothing. Dunbar last, in his sheriff's jacket, hat in his hand, who stood in the doorway for a moment taking in the room, the fire, the envelopes, the animals, the assembled faces, with the expression of a man who has arrived at a situation that has developed without him and is deciding how much authority he can plausibly assert. He looked at Juno in the doorway, who looked back at him. He stepped around her carefully and took the remaining chair. Wolfe looked at each of them in turn. He did not open with pleasantries, because he never does. "A man is dead," he said. "He was killed on the night of Monday the 9th of October by a person who came to his dock by boat in the dark, who overpowered him, who put him in the water, and who made the circumstances sufficiently ambiguous that a sheriff predisposed to simple conclusions would rule it accidental. He looked at Dunbar without particular accusation. That predisposition was cultivated deliberately over several months by a young man who positioned himself in this county for precisely that purpose. He is not in this room. He will be accounted for separately. Dunbar's face had gone the color of old chalk. Wolfe continued. The purpose of the murder was to prevent the disclosure of a document. The document in question is a signed witness account, authored by Drav Vasic in November of 1943, describing with specificity the deliberate abandonment of a 23-man partisan unit in occupied Yugoslavia by an American intelligence operative, whose decision caused the death of every man in that unit. He paused. The operative's name is on this table. The document bearing that name was kept by Vasic for 11 years against the moment when he could disclose it safely, with corroboration, through a channel he trusted. That moment arrived this autumn. He did not survive to see it completed. We will complete it for him. The fire made its sounds. The lake outside was fully dark now. Wolfe picked up the photograph and held it so the room could see it. This man was 39 years old when this photograph was taken in the mountains east of Sarajevo in November of 1943. He is now a man of considerable position and long-established reputation in this country. Both the position and the reputation rest on the grave of what he did in those mountains. He set the photograph down. His name is not unknown to several people in this room. I will not speak it here because speaking it here serves no legal purpose. It will be spoken in the correct venue, with the correct documentation, before the correct authority. He looked at Strand. Which you will facilitate? Strand said yes. Just that. No qualification. Mr. Oost, Wolfe said. Oost straightened slightly in his chair. Yes, you were at your scope at 5:15 on the morning of October 10th. You were not watching for birds. What were you watching for? The room was very quiet. Juno, in the doorway, had not moved. Oost looked at Wolfe for a long moment. I had been watching for 3 nights, he said. Drav told me in September that he thought someone was using his dock at night. He had found marks on the dock post, a rope, used repeatedly. He didn't know who. I told him I would watch from my side. He paused. On the 8th, Sunday, I saw a boat cross from the south end of the lake to his dock at 2 in the morning. It came back empty 20 minutes later. I didn't understand what that meant until Tuesday morning, when Roy Peck found him. Why didn't you tell the sheriff? Dunbar said, the color returning to his face in an uneven way. Oost looked at him steadily. Because by Tuesday morning I understood that whoever had been using that dock at night had also arranged for a deputy to be in place in this county, and I did not know how far that arrangement extended. He paused. I apologize for the judgment. I may have been wrong. Dunbar absorbed this. He did not respond, which was probably the wisest thing he had done all week. The boat you saw on Sunday night, I said. Aluminum canoe? Yes. Single occupant? Yes. Wolfe looked at me. I nodded. He looked back at the room. The man who came in that canoe on Sunday night, Wolfe said, was not there to kill Vasic. He was there to search the study. He found the compartment in the floor. He found it empty because Vasic had moved the document 4 days earlier. He searched the study and found nothing and left. He paused. He came back Monday night with different instructions. The fire settled. A log shifted and threw sparks against the screen. And Monday night, Marta said. Her voice was even. He didn't leave empty-handed. No, Wolfe said. He did not. He looked at her. Your father did not die easily or without resistance. The marks on the dock post showed the rope had been used with force on that final night. The wood compressed more deeply than on previous visits. Whatever happened on that dock, Dre Vasic was not a passive participant. He paused. He was not surprised. He knew the man had been coming. He may have gone to the dock deliberately, to confront, to negotiate, to attempt some resolution that did not involve his death. He misjudged. Marta nodded once. Her hands were still in her lap. He was always more thorough than the situation required, she said quietly. Except once. Except once, Wolfe agreed. The resolution of the operative details took another 40 minutes. Wolfe laid it out with the precision he brings to everything. Carver's placement, the law firm, the chain of instruction from a man of position in the city to a junior partner to a young deputy who had made himself useful and was now, I suspected, discovering what being useful to certain people ultimately costs. He told Dunbar what he would need to do in the morning, which was considerable, and told Strand what he would need to facilitate in Albany, which was more so. He told Reed that his research would be part of the record, and that his name would be associated with the case in ways that would do his academic career no harm, and that Vasich would have been pleased by his work. Reedy looked at the fire for a moment. He was extraordinary, he said. I only knew him for 11 days, but he was the most deliberate man I've ever met. Every single thing he did had a reason that extended further than you could see at the time. Yes, Wolfe said. That was precisely him. Through all of this, the animals had not moved. Keto beside Wolfe's chair. Juno at the door. Ajax at the window. Zora in her corner, watching everything. It was during the last 20 minutes, during the procedural discussion with Dunbar about jurisdiction and warrants and the federal attorney in Albany, that Ajax left the window. He crossed the room and went out through the hall, and I heard him at the front door, not barking, not growling, but producing the low continuous sound that I had learned meant something was outside that should not be. I was at the door in seconds. The front drive was dark, the cars lined in the gravel, the birch trees at the edge of the property showing pale in what was left of the night's ambient light. I stood on the porch and listened. A sound, not large, not dramatic, the scrape of a foot on gravel, from the direction of the tree line to the left of the drive. I went back inside and took my .38 from my jacket pocket and went back out and went left around the porch into the dark. He was at the edge of the trees, 30 feet from the nearest car, standing with the stillness of a man who has been watching the lit windows of the house and trying to decide something. He was young, 26 or so, in dark clothing that was not the blue jacket, because he had thought about that at least. He heard me before he saw me. He turned and ran. He made it 12 feet. Ajax had come round the other side of the porch. I will say for Carver that he did not panic, and he did not do anything that required me to make a report about it afterward. He stopped. He stood very still. Ajax stood 8 feet from him and made no sound at all, which is considerably more frightening than any sound a dog can make, and after a moment Carver put his hands up with the defeated practicality of a young man who has understood, finally, that useful is not the same as protected. I walked up behind him and removed the small revolver from his coat pocket and told him to turn round. And he did, and I marched him up the porch steps and through the front door, and into the sitting room where Sheriff Dunbar was waiting with the expression of a man who has had a complicated week and has just watched it become his problem to solve. The room looked at Carver. Carver looked at the room. Then he looked at Zora in the corner. Zora looked back at him with the absolute unblinking focus of an animal that has decided someone is worth watching. Carver, to his credit, managed to hold her gaze for almost 4 seconds before he looked away. "Sheriff," Wolfe said, "your deputy." Dunbar stood, put his hat on, and crossed the room with the careful deliberateness of a man reassembling his authority from components that had been scattered. He took Carver by the arm. "You are going to tell me everything," he said. "Yes, sir," Carver said. He said it with the exhausted simplicity of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and is relieved to put it down, regardless of the consequences of the putting down. They went out. The room stayed as it was for a moment. Fire, lake-dark windows, the envelopes on the table, the people in their chairs. Then Oost stood and said he would row back across the lake, and Strand said he had telephone calls to make, and Reed sat looking at the fire with his satchel on his knee, and Marta stood and said good night to each person by name as they left, which I thought was a thing her father would have recognized. I stood by the door and watched it all conclude. At 10 o'clock it was just Wolfe and me in the sitting room, and the 4 animals. Cato had moved from beside the chair to in front of the fire, which he had not done before, and was lying with his head on his forelegs looking at the flames with what I can only describe as satisfaction. Juno was beside me, leaning very slightly against my leg. Ajax had come back in from the porch and stationed himself at Wolfe's feet, which was also new, and Zora had moved. She was 4 feet from Wolfe's chair, the closest she had come, still on her own terms, still not touching, still sovereign, but 4 feet, when 12 had been where she started, and 6 had felt like progress. Wolfe was looking at her. She was looking at him. I said nothing. I poured myself a small rye from the bottle I had relocated to the sitting room sideboard earlier in the evening, on the principle that it was going to be that kind of night, and I sat across from Wolfe and drank it, and the fire burned down, and the lake outside was perfectly dark and perfectly still. After a while, Wolfe said, without looking away from Zora, he would have been glad. It was the only time in 7 days he said anything about Vasich that was not a question or a statement of fact, and I did not respond to it because there was no response it required. We sat there for another half hour, and then I went to bed, and Wolfe stayed in the sitting room with the fire and the 4 animals and whatever he was thinking, and I did not ask him about it in the morning or any other time, because some things are not my business, and 11 years has taught me which ones. Chapter 8. The Drive Home. We left on a Friday morning. The week had run its full course. 7 days, as Wolfe had said, though the 7th had resolved things with a completeness that the first 6 had only promised. By Thursday evening, Dunbar had Carver in custody in the county jail and had been on the telephone to the state police and the federal attorney in Albany for most of the night, emerging from that process looking older and more serious than he had on Tuesday morning, when I had first sat across his desk and pointed out the problem with 40 yards of flat still water. Strand had driven back to Albany on Thursday afternoon with both envelopes, the original and Reed's copy, and the photograph and Reed's research folder, going directly to the federal attorney's office to begin the process that Wolfe had set in motion and that would, in the months that followed, conclude in ways I will not detail here because they are not part of this story. What is part of this story is that they concluded, and concluded correctly, and that Drav Vasic's 11 years of patience was not wasted. Reed had driven back to Manhattan on Thursday evening, the satchel lighter than it had arrived, his expression the complicated one of a young scholar who has done serious work and understands that serious work has serious consequences and is deciding whether he is glad or simply marked by it. I thought he would be all right. He had the quality that matters, not fearlessness, which is usually just inexperience, but the capacity to be afraid and proceed anyway, which is the actual thing. Boost had come across the lake one more time Thursday morning. He sat with Wolfe on the back porch for an hour, and I did not listen because I had enough and some conversations should remain on the porch where they happen. When he left, he shook Wolfe's hand and said something I did not hear, and went back down to his rowboat and across the lake, and I watched him go and thought about a man who had watched a dark water for 3 nights, and had understood too late, and had sat at his scope at 5:15 in the cold morning, watching for something he could not prevent, and could not bring himself to stop watching for. Ruth Halsey came Friday morning to continue the work of boxing Vasic's things, and I told her what she needed to know, which was that the matter was resolved, and that Vasic had not died for nothing, and she received this information with the composure of a woman who had already decided to believe that, and was glad to have it confirmed. She was still in the study when we left, working quietly among the books and the drawings. Marta walked us to the car. The loading of the Buick took longer than the previous Sunday's loading, because we now had 4 animals instead of 3, and because Zora had not previously been in a car and had opinions about the process. The 3 Dobermans loaded with their established efficiency, Cato first with authority, Juno, who had taken a particular interest in the passenger side door and needed to be redirected, Ajax, who went in with the focused readiness of a dog who considers every new situation a professional opportunity, then Zora. She looked at the car for a long time. She looked at Wolfe, who was standing beside the passenger door waiting with the patience of a man who has decided that dignity requires him to pretend he is not anxious about the next 5 minutes. She looked at the car again. Then she looked at Cato, already in the back seat. Cato looked back at her with the mild authority of the alpha, which in cheetah to dog translation apparently means something along the lines of "it is acceptable in here," because Zora stepped forward and put one foot on the running board and then, with the compressed deliberateness of a cat doing something she has decided to do on her own terms, got into the car. She went to the far corner of the back seat, behind the driver, and arranged herself against the door with the composed authority of an animal who has decided that if this is happening, it will happen correctly, and looked out the window at the lake. Fritz, watching this from beside the provision crate, exhaled slowly. "Bon," he said to no one in particular, and loaded the last of the bags. Marta stood at the edge of the drive in her grey sweater with her arms crossed in the way she held herself, and she looked at the car and then at Wolfe. "My father was right about you," she said. Wolfe regarded her for a moment. "I hope to prove deserving of that assessment over time," he said. "You will hear from me." It was not a pleasantry. Wolfe does not issue pleasantries. She understood it as the commitment it was, which I could see in the way she received it, not with gratitude exactly, but with the recognition of a woman who has been given something she had not known she needed until it was offered. She looked at the 4 animals in the car. "He spent so long on them," she said. "I used to think it was excessive, all that time, all that patience." She paused. "I understand it now. He built something that will outlast the occasion that required it," Wolfe said. "That is the best work a man can do." He got into the car. I shook Marta's hand and told her she had handled a very difficult week with more grace than most people manage in ordinary ones, which was true, and she almost smiled, which for Marta Vasic was the equivalent of a standing ovation, and I got behind the wheel and we drove down the gravel track through the birch trees and onto the county road and turned south. The mountains were at their peak. I had driven north on a Tuesday in early October when the color was beginning, and I drove south on a Friday when it had arrived in full, the birch trees yellow-white, the maples running from gold through orange, through the particular red that has no good name, the hillsides composed of color, the way a fire is composed of heat, the whole landscape doing the thing it does once a year that makes people drive long distances for no other purpose than to look at it. Wolfe looked at it. He did not read. He had a book. He always had a book. But it stayed closed on his knee for the first 2 hours, while he watched the mountains and the trees and the sky doing what they were doing, and his face had the expression I had tried to categorize on the way up, and still had no precise word for. Closer now to something I recognized, the expression of a man who has set something down after carrying it for a very long time, and is discovering with some surprise that his hands are empty. In the back seat, by arrangement of circumstance and preference, the following situation had developed. Cato along the left side, Juno in the middle, Ajax on the right side by the window, which he had claimed with the focused satisfaction of a dog who considers passing terrain a professional briefing, and Zora in the far corner behind me, with Cato's flank 6 inches from hers, not touching, maintaining the sovereign distance she maintained from everything, but 6 inches, which is a different kind of not touching than 12 feet. Fritz, who had not fit in the back, was in the middle seat of the extended configuration I had arranged the evening before with some mechanical effort and a great deal of muttering, and he was sitting with the upright composure of a man who has decided that proximity to 4 large animals is simply a condition of the journey and is managing it with dignity. At 9:30 I stopped at the same diner outside Glens Falls where we had stopped on the way up. Same parking lot, same cold air, same mountains to the north making the sky feel like something you could reach. I got out and stretched, and Wolfe got out and stood beside the car and breathed for a moment, and Cato came out and stood beside him, and they both looked north at the mountains for a moment in the way they had been doing things all week. Together, without discussion, in the particular alignment of 2 creatures who have decided they suit each other. Then Wolfe said, without turning, "You have a question." "Several," I said. "1. I had been selecting since approximately Glens Falls." "Oost," I said. "On the porch yesterday morning. What did he tell you?" Wolfe was quiet for a moment. "He told me that on the night of Monday the 9th he woke at 2 o'clock and went to his window and saw the canoe cross the lake from the south and tie up at Vasich dock. He watched for 20 minutes. The canoe did not return. He fell asleep in his chair at the window. He paused. He woke at 5 and went to the scope and watched until Roy Peck found the body. He did not call the sheriff because he had already understood, from the canoe's failure to return, what had happened and what calling the sheriff in this particular county would accomplish. He saw Carver go to the dock," I said, "and not come back." "He saw the canoe not come back," Wolfe said. "He did not see Carver. It was too dark. He looked at the mountains. He carries the weight of having watched and not acted. I told him that the window in which action would have saved Vasich had already closed before he woke at 2, that Vasich had been in the water for some time before the canoe arrived." He paused. He understood this. Whether understanding will reduce the weight I cannot say. These things do not always lighten when they are explained. I thought about that. Was it true that the window had closed? "The coroner's estimate," Wolfe said, "which Dunbar has now requested be revised in light of the full circumstances, places the time of death between 10 and midnight. Carver returned the canoe after midnight. The canoe's return trip was the return trip of a man who had finished, not a man who was going to." He looked at me. Yes, it was true. We went into the diner. Fritz had coffee. Wolfe had coffee and a piece of pie that he examined with the skepticism of a man who has been eating Fritz's cooking for a week and is recalibrating his relationship with other people's food. He ate it anyway. We drove on. South of Albany, the mountains began to flatten, and the color thinned and the highway widened, and the exits multiplied, and the sky acquired the particular quality of a sky that is getting ready for a city, lower, grayer, freighted with use. The Buick moved through it, and the 4 animals in the back adjusted their collective posture the way passengers do when they feel the approach of destination, and Fritz opened his window and closed it again, and began organizing the provision crate with the focused industry of a man assembling his sense of normalcy. Wolfe picked up his book. He read for 20 minutes and then said, without looking up, "What is your assessment of the case?" This is the question. Not what do you think, and not how did we do, but the specific formal question he asks when he wants my full account and is prepared to respond to it. I had been composing since the diner. Vasich built a system, I said. A complete system. The document, the copy, the scholar to authenticate it, the animals to carry the alarm, the daughter to retrieve and hold the evidence, and you at the center of it as the mechanism of resolution. He built it over years, and he built it to survive his own death, which he must have known was a real possibility once he decided to move toward disclosure. I paused. The only thing he didn't build into the system was a protection for himself. He had protections for everything else, and nothing for himself. Because he had made his peace with the personal risk, Wolfe said. He was still reading, or appearing to read. That's what I thought, I said. He calculated that the system was more important than the man running it, and he built accordingly. The system worked. The man died. I paused. Which is either a success or a failure depending on how you define the terms. It is both, Wolfe said. Which is usually the case with the things that matter. He turned a page. What are you wrong about? I had been waiting for this. Oost, I said. I had him in the wrong column for too long. I was looking at his alibi as constructed rather than as genuine, and the canoe measurement as evidence of involvement rather than propinquity. I should have asked sooner why a man who studies birds was at his scope before the light was useful. You asked when it mattered, Wolfe said. The question is not whether you were wrong. The question is whether being wrong for that period affected the outcome. It didn't. Then learn from it and move forward. He turned another page. You are right about everything else. In 11 years he has said this to me 4 times. I have counted them. I did not say this to him. I drove. We crossed into Manhattan at 2:40 in the afternoon. The city came up around the Buick the way the city always does, not gradually but all at once, as though it has been waiting around a corner and steps out. The noise of it, the scale of it, the particular smell of a city that does not apologize for being itself. I watched Wolfe take it in and return to his book with the air of a man resuming a conversation that had been briefly interrupted. I watched the 4 animals. The Dobermans had done this before, or Cato and Juno had. Igax having been born into the brownstone life via Vasic's mountain training and not Manhattan streets. Cato received the city with the same composure he received everything. Juno looked with interest at the street-level activity, the particular alertness of a dog who reads situations through the behavior of the people in them. Igax was looking at everything with an intensity that was not anxiety but full-scope attention, processing, cataloging, building the map, and Zora. Zora looked at Manhattan. I watched her in the rear-view mirror. She was at her window and the city was going past it, the streets, the buildings, the people, the impossible compressed human density of it, and her expression, if an expression is something a cheetah can be said to have, was the expression of an animal encountering something so far outside its framework of reference that the only appropriate response is to observe it with complete attention and make no premature conclusions. She was magnificent. I turned west on 35th and came down the block and pulled up in front of the brownstone, 918 West 35th Street, 4 stories of New York brownstone that is Nero Wolfe's castle, kingdom and primary argument for the value of not going anywhere. The stoop, the black iron railing, the 3 front steps, the window of Wolfe's office on the right where the orchid plant that Wolfe has not watered in 8 days is probably making its feelings known to Theodore, who has been managing the plant rooms in our absence and has left 3 messages with my answering service of increasing horticultural urgency. I parked and got out and opened the back door. Cato stepped out first. He stood on the sidewalk of West 35th Street and looked at the brownstone with the quiet authority of a dog arriving at a decision, and then he went up the 3 steps and sat in front of the door. Not scratching, not whining, sitting, waiting for the door to open, because the door was going to open and he was going to go through it, and this was where things were now. Juno came out and went up the steps and sat beside him. Ijax came out and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up and down the block, with the focused professional attention of a dog doing an initial security survey of a new perimeter. He went up the steps. Fritz came around from the passenger side and opened the back door fully and stood back. Zora looked at the door. She looked at the street. She looked at the brownstone's facade, taking it in the way she had taken in the city, completely, without rush, making no premature conclusions. She looked at Wolfe, who was on the sidewalk beside the car, watching her. He said nothing. He did not gesture, did not beckon. He simply stood on the sidewalk of West 35th Street in his good coat with his hat in his hand and waited, which is something Nero Wolfe almost never does for anyone. Zora stepped out of the car. She put 1 foot on the sidewalk, and then the others, and stood on the pavement of Manhattan, and looked at the block and the buildings and the 3 Dobermans on the steps, and Wolfe beside her, and the brownstone in front of her. Then she walked to the steps and went up them. At the top she stopped. She turned and looked back. Not at the street, not at the car, not at Fritz efficiently managing the provision crate. At Wolfe, still on the sidewalk below. He came up the steps. Fritz opened the door. The 3 Dobermans went in. Zora went in. Wolfe went in. Fritz went in with the first load, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at the closed door of 918 West 35th Street and thinking about a man in a mountain house who had built a system to survive his own death, and how the last component of that system had just walked through a door in Manhattan with the composed authority of an animal who had decided that this was where things were now. I went up the steps and through the door. The brownstone received them. This is the only way I know how to put it. The house has a character. It has been Wolfe's house for long enough that it has absorbed something of him, or he has shaped it so precisely to his requirements that the shape of the house and the shape of the man have become the same shape. It is a house that knows what it is. The four animals walked into it, and the house received them. Cato went directly to the office doorway and stood there, looking in at Wolfe's desk and Wolfe's chair and the bookshelves and the three paintings on the wall, and then he went in and positioned himself to the left of the desk and sat, as though he had been shown the position, as though this was the position he had been moving toward for the entire week. Juno went through the house at a measured pace, not Ajax's security circuit, but the slower, more social movement of an animal establishing relationships with spaces. She went to the kitchen, where she and Fritz regarded each other for a moment in mutual assessment, before Fritz went back to his work, and she installed herself near the hallway door, which put her at the intersection of kitchen and hall, and gave her access to both in the way that suited her nature. Ajax did his circuit. First floor, second floor, up to the plant rooms where Theodore was starting to say something about the state of the cattleyas, and stopped when Ajax looked at him with the alert professional focus that tends to stop most speeches, then back down and through and around and out to the small garden in the back and around the perimeter and in again. And when he was done, he stationed himself at the front door and looked at it with the satisfaction of a dog who has secured a perimeter and found it acceptable. And Zora went to the office. She walked past Cato at the left of the desk and went to the right side, where there is a space between the desk and the bookshelves, and she lay down in it. She was not visible from the doorway. She was directly beside where Wolfe's right hand rests on the arm of his chair when he is sitting at his desk. Wolfe stood in the office doorway and looked at this arrangement. Then he went to his chair and sat in it, and settled, and picked up the book he had left on the desk 8 days ago with a bookmark in it, and opened it to the marked page. His right hand rested on the arm of the chair, 6 inches from Zora. Neither of them acknowledged this. At 4 o'clock, Fritz brought beer, and I was at my desk doing the expense accounting for the week, an exercise that was going to require some creativity given that the line item for cheetah transport did not exist in our standard fee structure. And Wolfe was reading, and the house was doing what it does when a case is finished and the routine has resumed, which is to settle into its rhythms with the solidity of a thing that knows what it is. Theodore called down from the plant rooms to say the cattleyas had not suffered irreparably, but he wanted it noted that 8 days was the outer limit, and he would appreciate advance notice in future if this sort of thing was going to recur, and Wolfe told him it was noted, and went back to his book. Lone Cohen called to say his contact at the federal attorney's office in Albany had confirmed receipt of materials, and he wanted to know when Wolfe was going to give the Gazette its story, and Wolfe told him 2 weeks and a byline and hung up. Inspector Kramer called. He always seems to know when something has concluded. I have never understood the mechanism, and said he had heard Wolfe had been out of the city, which was unprecedented, and he was calling to confirm that whatever Wolfe had been doing up there, it was not going to land on his desk, and Wolfe said it would not land on his desk, but it might land on his newspaper. And Kramer said, what does that mean? And Wolfe said it means read the Gazette in 2 weeks and hung up. At 5, Wolfe went up to the plant rooms. I sat at my desk in the quiet office. Cato was to the left of the desk. Zora was to the right, invisible from where I sat. Ajax had finished his 3rd circuit of the day and was at the front door. Juno was at the kitchen hall intersection, following a domestic geometry she had established within the first hour, and would not significantly revise for the rest of her life in this house. I looked at the expense accounting. I looked at the office, the familiar room with the familiar books and the familiar paintings and the desk where I have sat for 11 years doing the work that needs doing, and I thought about how it was the same room and not the same room, and how that is usually how the important things happen, without announcement, by addition rather than replacement, so that what was there before is still there and what is new is simply also there, and you look up one day and the room that was one thing is now another thing that contains the first thing, and you cannot put your finger on the moment it changed because there was no moment, there was only the slow accumulation of days. Wolfe came back down at 6, which was early. He came into the office and sat in his chair, and Fritz brought the pre-dinner beer, and Wolfe opened his book. His right hand rested on the chair arm, 6 inches from Zora. I finished the expense accounting and closed the notebook and looked at nothing for a moment. Wolfe, I said. He turned a page. Yes, he would have been glad, I said. You said that last night, in the sitting room, after everyone left. I think you were right. Wolfe did not look up from the book. He was quiet for a moment, not the thinking quiet and not the I am not going to answer quiet, but the third kind, the one I have no precise name for, the one that means he has heard something he considers worth receiving. Yes, he said. I believe so. He read. I sat. The brownstone went about its business around us, Fritz in the kitchen beginning whatever Friday dinner was going to be, Ajax at his post, Juno at hers, Cato at his, and Zora in the space beside the desk that she had chosen and would not relinquish for the remainder of her years in this house. Outside, West 35th Street went about its business. The city went about its business. The world, largely indifferent to what had been resolved in a mountain sitting room the previous evening, continued in its established directions. Inside the brownstone, in the office, two creatures who had been oriented toward each other by a dead man's 2 years of patient work sat 6 inches apart in the late Friday afternoon, and did not acknowledge the 6 inches, and did not need to, because 6 inches is not 12 feet and not 4 feet, and is in its way everything. I wrote my case notes. The case notes for this one ran to 14 pages, which is longer than average. On the last page, after the summary of facts and the account of resolution, and the list of parties and outcomes, I wrote one additional line that I do not usually write, because I do not usually feel the need. He was right about Wolfe. He was right about all of it. He built something that worked. I closed the notebook. Fritz appeared in the doorway and said dinner would be 40 minutes and it was going to be the veal, and Wolfe said good, and Fritz went back to the kitchen, and the office settled into the particular quiet of a room in which everything is exactly where it belongs.